meeting of the 25th of January. My name is Councillor Julie Gurkut and I will be chairing the meeting this morning. Please can you maintain social distancing at all times and wear face coverings at all times in the venue unless you have an exemption or are seated, in which case you can remove it. Please can I request that mobile telephones and other such equipment is switched to silent mode so as not to disturb the conduct of the meeting. There's no planned fire test today. If there is an emergency evacuation, please take instructions from the staff and the assembly point is Tudor Square. Before we start the meeting, can I ask that all members please introduce themselves, and we'll start with Mike.
Councillor Mike Levery, West Ecclesfield Ward.
Councillor Penny Baker, Stannington Ward.
Councillor Sue Alston, Fulwood Ward.
Councillor Peter Garbett, Nether Edge and Sharrow Ward.
Councillor Christine Gilligan, Hillsborough Ward.
Councillor Mary Lee, Darnell Ward.
Councillor Shoned Meyer, Richards, Manor and Castle Ward.
Councillor Dorndale, Shire Green and Brightside Ward.
Councillor Mark Jones, Burngreave Ward.
Thank you. We also have a number of officers in the room with us. Can they all introduce themselves? We'll start with Sarah, please.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah Bennett, Assistant Director, Legal and Governance.
Eugene Walker, Executive Director, Resources.
Jay Bell, Committee Secretary.
Laurie Brennan, Head of Policy and Partnerships.
Laura Reynolds, Business Change Manager, working on the engagement project.
Democratic Services, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Jay, do we have any apologies for absence, please?
Chair, I received apologies from Councillor Marmin Roof.
Thank you. Item 3 is exclusion of the press and public. There are no items where we need to exclude the press or public this morning. And item 4 is declarations of interest. Can I ask members whether you have any interest to declare, please? Item 5 is minutes of the previous meetings. We have 3 separate sets of minutes to approve. The first is for the minutes of the 30th of November. There are 4 pages of minutes. Are we all happy to approve those minutes, please?
Agreed.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. The next is the 7th of December. Are we all happy to approve those minutes, please? Thank you. And the third set is the 8th of December. Are we all happy to approve those, please? Thank you. Public questions and petitions. We do have some public questions. Alex, you're going to read out the questions for us, please.
Thank you. Good morning. We've got a series of, I think, 6 questions from Ruth Hubbard of It's Our City. The first is as follows. The work developing design principles for a new committee system took place over 4 months, including some intensive work with stakeholders and members of the public who gave their time willingly to contribute. Is it not clear how the committee system structure report, it is not clear how the committee system structure report relates to, aligns with, or puts the principles and their implicit outcomes into practice. In some cases, what is being proposed seems to be in active tension with or in opposition to the principles. What was the point of all that work and citizen stakeholder input? I recognise that the report covers a limited number of core issues at this stage, but isn't this part of the governance problem? Stated council commitments with little real meaning and no actual demonstrable impact or influence via engagement and consultation.
Sorry, Chair, can I just interrupt? Would it be possible for us as members to have copies of those questions? Yeah, afterwards maybe, but just so that, because just hearing them read out now doesn't give us time to reflect very much on them.
Yeah, that's not a problem. We can make sure that happens. First of all, Ruth, thank you for the questions. As always, they are greatly appreciated. In response to the first question, in our first inquiry meeting on the 30th of November, members formally agreed in public to use the design principles both when considering the various options and when reviewing later on how the new system is working. The way that those principles changed significantly during the development, clearly showing the impact citizens and stakeholders impact. It is my expectation as the Chair that evidence from all three sessions of the inquiry and the principles should be in the forefront of members' minds when giving consideration to the options presented today. Thank you.
Ruth's second question is as follows. 8 main committees are proposed, plus a significant finance subcommittee. What makes Sheffield an exception and extreme outlier on this, especially in the face of evidence received and statutory guidance? And from the Wirral, where a very recent external assurance review by the government's DLUHC is requiring a reduction in their number of main committees, a reduction not from 8 but 7 committees. Being an extreme outlier with 8 main committees would also be an explicit and conscious decision to very likely increase both bureaucracy and resource load, and that would also go against the design principles. How is this justifiable in the current circumstances, and what do you think voters will think if this is the decision?
Thank you, Alex. As we all know, this is a matter for the committee to consider today, of course. It is dealt with at section 9 of our next report, so thank you for those comments. I think there are a couple of things I would add in relation to that. It appears to me that under the proposals, everyone, as they're set out in the report, every councillor would have an average of 3 or 4 seats. Oh, sorry. Rewind. I'll start again. Sorry. Right. In the new world, as we are now, we are putting in a lot of work into how we bring the voice of residents into the whole decision-making process.
I think you're looking for this part, section 4 of. There are a lot of questions.
I apologise.
Right.
I'm really sorry about this. That might be helpful. Thank you. Because they're all in a real mess now. So, let's start again. Do you want to reread the question, Alex? It's a long question. Well, I just think in fairness.
Okay, let me reread the question. 8 main committees are proposed, plus a significant finance subcommittee. What makes Sheffield an exception and extreme outlier on this, especially in the face of evidence received and statutory guidance? And from the Wirral, where a very recent external assurance review by the government's DLUHC is requiring a reduction in the number of main committees from 8, not 8, but 7 committees. Being an extreme outlier with 8 main committees would also be an explicit and conscious decision to very likely increase both bureaucracy and resource load, and that would also go against the design principles. How is this justifiable in the current circumstances, and what do you think voters will think if this is the decision?
Try again. Section 4 of the report deals with this issue. Members heard through the inquiry process that there are risks to having too many committees. However, we also heard that it is critical to align committees to the way that business works. This is to avoid things like senior officers losing capacity due to needing to attend and prepare for multi-committees on every month, and to make sure that financial accountability is clear. The report proposes that the scale and complexity of the Council's business as the first ever core city to move to the committee system means that there are actually benefits overall in terms of timeliness, reducing bureaucracy and aligning committees to the functional areas of the Council and their clearly distinct budgets. We heard from the Chief Executive that in her view there were 7 of these functional areas. Then there is the cross-cutting committee making this number up to 8. Members today at the Council in March can take a view as to whether these risks and benefits have been appropriately weighed up.
Ruth's third question is, the proposal appears to be to exclude some or a few elected councillors from playing a full role on at least one of the main committees. This would, of course, be more than bad faith following the community campaign and referendum. I am sure citizens and communities would be very active in ensuring relevant ward voters were aware if any of their councillors were not representing them in a main committee decision-making role, or if particular parties were against all their councillors sitting on a main committee. At one point, the proposal seems to be driven by the maths, rather than the imperative for change, core purpose, principle, or intended outcome. This approach seems highly inadvisable when it's clear some other councils have 13, 15, and even 17 on committees and are operating effectively. Will the committee carefully rethink and reject this proposal?
Thank you, Alex. This is a matter for committee to consider today. It is dealt with at section 9 of the report. It also appears to me that under these proposals, every councillor will have an average of 3 or 4 committee seats on the real decision-making committees. This committee is mindful of the need to ensure that the role of a city councillor is not so onerous as to prevent ordinary people with families and jobs from being able to become councillors. The more seats we create on committees at the town hall, the less time members can spend in their local wards.
Ruth's fourth question is as follows. The paper also appears to be inching more and more in the direction of giving a range of additional powers to the overarching Strategy and Resources Committee. For example, suggested additional powers to make urgent decisions, suggested additional powers to do external scrutiny tasks, when these could and should be integrated into main committee work. The necessary shift in thinking away from the strong leader governance does not appear quite to have been made, despite the pretty unanimous warnings on this point given in evidence in the inquiry sessions and in consultations. Does the Governance Committee agree with the expert John Cade from InloGov, who you heard from, that it would be a betrayal to somehow try to recreate a cabinet function? Conversely, can the committee not see the value of a Strategy and Resources Committee that is more strategic, connecting things up, overseeing the budget as a whole, and so on, as has been presented in evidence to you?
Again, members today will have to consider this point as we go through the next paper, but I can say that the committee are absolutely mindful of what it means to move away from a cabinet system to a committee system, and I have heard nobody attempt to artificially prolong the old way of doing things. I hope I can reassure you somewhat anyway, because of the clue of the primary functions of the proposed Strategy and Resources Committee are in the name to operate strategically, joining up cross-cutting issues across other committees and to oversee the finances exactly as you ask.
The fifth question is section 13 on post-decision scrutiny, especially paragraphs 13.1 to 13.3, is problematic. It also contains inaccuracies and significant omissions that amount to inaccuracies. For example, sentence 1 could just as easily say that the emphasis is on collaboration and the potential for consensual decision-making. Sentence 2 is inaccurate. It was always possible to have different parties in cabinet. It's just that Sheffield ruling groups have chosen not to do this, as some other councils do. Indeed, this choice is what has contributed to such a big democratic deficit in Sheffield, which was the main reason for the petition and referendum. Paragraphs 13.2 and 13.3 are also highly problematic, and they omit a fundamental purpose of scrutiny to amplify the voices of the public and stakeholders. Please can this section of the report be at least corrected and amended? However, I would prefer it to be fully reviewed and rewritten, as it fails to understand the significance of the shift to good decision-making in a modern committee system, and how this incorporates many of the functions and good work of scrutiny.
I do agree that one role of scrutiny was to find ways of working to bring the voices of residents into the decision-making process. This was always a challenge, since scrutiny committees weren't able to make formal decisions on the back of what they had heard. In the new world, as you know, we are putting a lot of thought into how to bring the voice of residents into the whole decision-making process, and this is the subject of our second substantive agenda item today.
The final question is, the report omits any mention of stakeholder input. As above, vital if one wants to ensure that the strengths of scrutiny are built in, and also vital for good decision-making, but also essential for inclusive and improving democratic practices. There are simple, extremely resource-light and efficient participatory mechanisms that would be very easy to embed at the outset of new governance arrangements to ensure that a range of different stakeholders are heard directly in relevant policy committees and as a very solid starting point baseline position. Will the committee ensure that the new arrangements and constitution embed such a baseline for direct stakeholder involvement into main committees?
This is not omitted. This paper states clearly at 3.3 that stakeholder input is yet to be designed and that this will be crucial. The other main item on our agenda today deals with the progress on this matter. We have said clearly since September that because of the tight timescales and the need to work iteratively, we should first agree the what, i.e. an outline of the structure of the system, and then we can later add the how, i.e. ways of working within the system, including how to bring the voices of citizens into the process. Thank you, Alex, for your assistance with the questions. Item 7 is the committee structure. We have the agenda paper on that, and Alex, I understand you're going to present that to us today. Thank you.
Good morning, members. In November and December last year, this committee undertook an exercise which we called an inquiry, which I think I've heard from most of you that felt like a very useful process with all kinds of voices and opinions and views that have added value to the way that you as a committee and members as a whole are thinking about the big problem in front of us this year, the challenge, I should say, of designing a new governance system in a reasonably short space of time. There comes a point where some sort of proposal needs to come on the table with some real concrete detail in it in order that we can progress that conversation towards some real agreement on what at least the bones of that system will look like. So the report on the table in front of you all today represents that shift from potential to actual, and you know, to use a piece of jargon with apologies, you could think of it as a straw man, as a starting point that you may or may not agree with, and to give you something concrete to discuss today. This is, of course, not come from nowhere. The recommendations in this report are built out of discussions with councillors, the inquiry process itself, and recommendations from professional and statutory officers. So there is obviously a body of evidence that sits behind this. And the most important thing, as members go through this report today, is to keep in mind the volume and importance of the process that you followed so far to get to this point. I don't only mean that you need to keep the principles that you've already agreed in mind throughout today's discussion, although that is very important. I also don't only mean that you need to keep in mind all the evidence you've heard from the inquiry process, although that is also very important. But I'd encourage you to keep in mind the entire process, going back to way before the referendum, and everything that you've heard from citizens and stakeholder groups and other councillors along the way. You reach the point of decisions today, the first point of real decisions, and it's important that the weight of all of that is on your mind at this point. However, you're not the final decision makers on this matter. This committee is at this point being asked to agree a skeleton, in effect, a layout of a structure, a diagram, some ideas about how that might work, enough to give the monitoring officer of this council, in her statutory role, the direction to begin drafting the detail of a constitution. And that constitution and detailed instructions for what should go in it is what will, of course, be agreed by full council, initially at March before the next election, and probably in its final state at the AGM immediately after the election. I would imagine that'll be how it'll pan out. So what you're doing today is shaping what will be created for council's agreement, but things you decide today are not necessarily final, in that there is space for council to adjust that, of course. We've organised the report around the key areas which came out in the inquiry as kind of points that seemed plausible to gain some agreement on at this moment, and the kind of key bits of structure which will help us define the rest. This is why some things like how many committees are in this report, when I think we probably all agree it's not the most important question really, it's how these things operate that really matters. But knowing how many there are and being able to plan for that helps us organise things like the amount of officer resources we need and how we need to organise ourselves to help that work. And there's a lead-in time that we need to bear in mind, which is why we need to decide that sort of thing early. You've got a choice today, I think, as to whether you want to go through the report piece by piece and discuss and perhaps vote on each of those areas, or if you want to go through the recommendations. Obviously they align, but there is more detail in the report than in just the recommendations. I don't propose at this point, at the outset, to talk you through each of those parts of the report. You've got it in front of you and you've had some time to review it, although thank you for your patience in that it did come out a couple of days late. As you'd imagine, it's been a lot of work to get to this point. And I had the small matter of a baby over Christmas, which was slightly distracting. I'll leave that to you, and what I would suggest is that as you approach each part of this paper, whether you want to go through it recommendation by recommendation or page by page, I'm perfectly happy to be brought in to give a quick summary of the issues under discussion or an explanation of why that recommendation is what's come forward at this point. The last thing to say for the benefit of those who might be watching on the webcast today or in future is that, as you'd expect, the committee has had various opportunities to discuss this informally, both immediately after the meetings along the inquiry route and since over Christmas. So there is some context to coming into this report, and the committee have had some space to discuss this with their groups and to try and make sure that their thoughts are organised on political and personal grounds before coming into this meeting. On that basis, if there is any amendment proposed to any of these recommendations, we're suggesting a reasonably formal approach is taken to voting on those recommendations, so we can be absolutely clear, and a reminder about the process of agreeing an amendment to the substantive motion before then voting on the substantive motion if we do go down that path. But we'll guide you through it, but we will expect hands in the air and that kind of thing just to make sure we're absolutely clear if we get to that point. Okay, that's everything from me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Alex. Has anybody got a preferred way of going through the report? Would we be better, do you think, focusing on the recommendations? Or?
Chair, just a suggestion, but if we focus on each of the recommendations, but at the same time have an opportunity to ask questions before we make a decision or propose any amendments, I think that would be helpful.
So if we have a discussion around the recommendations and then we can, if we have any proposals, we can take them at that point. Would that work for everyone? Yep. There we have it.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, I'm being asked to say a little bit about recommendation 1 before we have a debate and then potentially a vote on that recommendation. Do I understand correctly, Chair? Yeah.
Can I just check that, because recommendation 1 has got lots of sub-bits, are we going to do each bit of that rather than just say a blanket one?
Yes, sorry, I should have said 1A and then 1B and so on. Quite right. Okay, so the recommendation 1A is, I suppose, best summed up in the Appendix 1, where you've got a diagram showing the number of committees in a sort of a structure chart. There is a discussion in the report about the relative merits and the benefits and disbenefits of having this particular number of committees. You heard through the inquiry process and you've seen in the evidence you received on the 30th of November that different councils have chosen different numbers and slightly different ways of organising their thoughts about how they would split those up. And there is clearly a line of thought that says that too many is too much new bureaucracy. But you also heard a lot about how important it was to make sure that there was no confusion, no kind of overburdensome cross-cutting between committees, so that, for example, some councils reported senior members needing to report in a cross-cutting way to a number of different committees, and the example of Wirral shows how important it is to make sure that committees are clearly aligned with budgets of the organisation, especially when there are financial issues for the council to tackle. On balance, the report suggests that 7 policy committees, in fact 8 policy committees is proposed, 7 of which are thematic, so organised by what are perceived to be the functional themes of an organisation of this type and size, as per the Chief Executive's comments in the inquiry. And the 8th of the policy committees is conceived as a strategy and resources committee, with some of the overarching roles that actually Ruth referred to in her question at the beginning, such as having a role to coordinate and recommend to Council the budget for the whole organisation and a corporate plan, which would in turn then provide a shape and a direction for the other policy committees. So those and some other, I guess, overarching type functions would be in that 8th committee. Oh, sorry, I've just realised that's really part of B. But anyway, 17 policy committees. The key thing to mention on this is that the main alternative proposal, the main option that was presented to you during the inquiry, was the option of organising these 7 committees, or organising your committees, I should say, by political priority area, or say parts of your corporate plan, for example, rather than by functional parts of the organisation. So really the choice that's being made here is to say that if we organise by function, we can be sure that even if political priorities change or the corporate plan priorities change over time, those functions are likely to remain reasonably stable and do currently and are likely to remain aligned to clear separate budgets. So that's kind of the logic that you're agreeing to by agreeing with this recommendation. If you do, is the continuation of that link, rather than going by a thematic basis.
Thank you, Alex. Any questions or comments? Councillor?
Thank you, Chair. We've obviously had a significant discussion about this within our group as well. The general feeling, I think, among our group is that we should support this as a way forward. There were some concerns along the lines that have been mentioned about the fact that we could end up with, maybe the best way to say it is that there may be political priorities may actually prove to be more important later on, but what we actually need at the minute is something straightforward. This seems like a sensible way forward, but it is something that we think we should review when we come to doing the review, and I think it's about 6 months afterwards. We generally agreed with the number of committees for the reasons that you've stated, that we don't want the committees to have too many people on because you don't get, it's not easy for discussion. But equally, there's also that balance about having a large proportion of councillors at least engaged in the policy making. So in summary, I think we would support this proposal, but we do want to review it and how it's working. And at some point in the future, it may be that 1 or 2 of the committees, well, it would have to be at least 2, may be combined, depending on workload and how that works out.
Thank you. I think that's eminently sensible in relation to, we do know that the review is an important part of this process, absolutely. Councillor Richards and Councillor Jones.
Oh, well, Councillor Alston has said what I was going to say. But in true councillor tradition, I will immediately say the same thing again in order to show that I'm speaking. But no, seriously, I think what Sue has said is what all of us here probably would echo, which is that what we are proposing isn't set in complete stone. That, you know, the fact that we're planning to review it 6 months afterwards means that, you know, we're thoroughly aware that it isn't, you know, what we're setting out here isn't, doesn't have to be what we end up with at the end. And I would echo as well the thing about not having huge committees. I have been a member of a different council where we had committees of 25 for everything. And what you ended up with, people not feeling they had to come because they knew other people would be there. But what that actually meant was that lots of people didn't come and the work ended up being done by a small number. I think smaller numbers on a committee do mean that people have to take more responsibility and feel part of that. So, yeah, let's start with this, and it may be that we will change it in time. I would also echo the fact that we are a large city, we're not a small district, so this reflects what the functions of a large city, a large complicated city has that we need to deal with and to govern. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think that this is a reasonable and an appropriate way to go forward. What I am cautious of, and I'll reflect on some of the questions that were put earlier, is we should not be looking to operate under some dogmatic approach. We shouldn't be going into this with a decided position, as the questioners may seem to be suggesting that they are. We will need to be using a pragmatic approach which evolves and grows into this. And though we, as Councillor Alston rightly reflects, we will be looking to review this 6 months in. However, I would say go further than that and say that we constantly review this year on year. And that is the process we're taking. We are looking at a dynamic city, a growing city, a thriving city. We are not a backwater. We have complex issues and complex things that we do need to deal with, and priorities will change over time as the topography of our city changes, both the demographic and the physical. So I do think this is an appropriate way forward, and I think that we should accept this one. That would be my recommendation to full council, and that's how I would be looking to vote on this. But yeah, Sue's definitely right. It's a pragmatic approach, not a dogmatic or a dictatic one. We don't want to be telling people what we're going to be doing. We'll be growing and listening. Thank you, Chair.
Any more comments? Okay then, 1A. The recommendation is for 7 themed policy committees which will be closely aligned to the functions of the council. All those in favour, please show. That is all. Thank you. And we are on to 1B. Is there any more you would like to say about 1B, Alex? Yeah.
So I strayed into this ground a little bit in my previous comments, so this will be more brief. The idea and a little bit of discussion on the proposed Strategy and Resources Policy Committee is at section 6 of your report. I think there was a pretty clear, I feel there was a pretty clear direction given from the witnesses that you heard from overall during the inquiry that said that the need for a space where cross-cutting issues and the budget as a whole was able to be discussed and steered in a coordinated fashion was not just seen as valuable but actually seen as critical in the functioning of an organisation of this size, especially given the financial challenges that organisations like this one are currently facing. There are some specifics here about how it's envisaged to work. This does include the idea that the chairs of all of the other policy committees would be expected to be on this Strategy and Resources Committee. The reasons for this, just to spell it out, are that if this committee is to be functionally coordinating and dealing with cross-cutting matters, it's crucially important that the people there are, first of all, very well informed about the detail of the work programmes of those other committees and are able to speak to some extent on behalf of those committees. And also because there is a need for decisions at that overarching committee to be taken away and acted on efficiently and effectively by those other committees. So that seems crucial. Of course, the committee will need to be politically proportionate. This is the defining feature of all decision-making bodies in this new system. And that means that it won't only be made up of chairs of the other committees, it'll be made up of those chairs plus members from whichever other parties, in whichever, or I should say groups, in whatever numbers are necessary to ensure that that committee is politically proportionate. And therein lies the main reason why this absolutely is not a cabinet by another name, because this is a space in which, with decision-making power that is absolutely equal to any of those chairs on that committee, there will be members of opposition party groups also present. I think that's the key points about the overarching Strategy and Resources Committee, because we're going to come on to the subcommittee in a moment. I'll just check whether there's a separate recommendation on the subcommittee. I think it's part of that, so in that case I will mention it. So there's a proposal on this, and you'll see in Appendix 1, it's drawn onto the chart, a standing finance subcommittee of this Strategy and Resources Committee. This again is something that we've seen in examples from other authorities as something that is very common and considered quite important by those authorities that have one. And as the report sets out there's a section on this, I think this was before section 6. Forgive me, I haven't got it to hand. Is it just there? I'm going to stop trying to find it because I can't do it and talk at the same time. The proposal is that the Finance Subcommittee helps avoid the Strategy and Resources Committee from being, first of all, overwhelmed by the volume of work needed to do proper justice to the financial management of an authority with a turnover of 1 billion plus. But secondly, it provides an opportunity for that kind of level of accountability and scrutiny from elected members in a really focused way on what is ultimately, the backbone of the way that an authority like this functions. So it's important that and we'll talk in a moment about subcommittees and the risk of their proliferation, but in this case, the operation of this as a subcommittee and reporting into that Strategy and Resources Committee was seen as important. So that is a functional part of the recommendation you'll be voting on in a moment.
Thank you, Alex. I've got Councillor Richards.
I've just thought of one other thing I should mention. In the report, there's a proposal that the Strategy and Resources Committee would be chaired, and this would be defined by the Constitution, by the leader of the Council. Given that they are likely to be the leader of the administration, I think this kind of makes sense and provides for that functional link between the political leadership and the operational leadership of the Council. There is also in the report a proposal that the Finance Subcommittee would be chaired by the leader of the Council.
Councillor Richards.
First note of dissent coming up. It's me on the Finance Subcommittee, which I don't think should be chaired by the leader of the Council. Finance, as we know, particularly this year, is huge. We actually have a whole cabinet member looking at the finances, and I think to do it justice, it needs to have a different person chairing it who actually has some responsibility for finance. The leader is going to be leading, and that's quite a big job, and therefore I would propose that the chair of the subcommittee should be somebody tasked specifically with looking at the finances of the council throughout the year. I'm not quite sure how you do it, because clearly you don't want it to be the chair of any of the other committees, because they're very busy with their own committees. But as you have said, that there is scope for somebody different on the Strategy and Resources Committee, maybe it'll be somebody from that. I don't quite know how. All I know is that it needs to be somebody in their own right chairing that committee.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Lee, Councillor Alston, then Councillor Gilligan.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to support what Shannon has said. I think this is the chair of that subcommittee, finance, it's a massive job. It's been a massive job over the last 10 years, 12 years, 11 years, and this year in particular. But I think, you know, it's such a job that covers the breadth of the council, and all other, you know, the chairs of all committees will be looking at their own finances, but I think the fact that it is so complex and so big, we need a separate chair to take that forward. So that's what I would be supporting what Councillor Mayor Richards has said about this.
Thank you. Councillor Austin.
Thank you. In the danger of us all singing from the same hymn sheet, absolutely agree. The chair of the finance subcommittee should not be the same person. That's not to say that the council leader should not be on that committee, but we generally felt this was far too big a role for one individual, and also the skill set that's required, is probably different, and so we would feel very much that it should be somebody separate. I also have a couple of questions, if I may, which somebody may be able to answer. Is it envisaged that decisions of the finance subcommittee could or would be overturned by the full strategy committee? And what sort of proportion, in terms of numbers, how big is the finance subcommittee likely to be in relation to the strategy and resources committee that it's a subcommittee of?
Good questions.
Shall I address the questions before the rest of the debate? So, in terms of can decisions be overturned, we can design this. So, in a way, it's up to you as a committee to give me a feel for what you think it should be. What I would say is that when any body, such as a committee, delegates authority to a body that sits beneath it, such as a subcommittee, they always reserve the right to withdraw decision-making authority from that committee on any particular issue. So I would expect that the committee would be able to intervene or something along those lines. We would need to look at whether that could be before or after subcommittee decisions, or indeed whether subcommittee decisions would need to be ratified by the parent committee, and all of that is up for definition. I don't think this report seeks to clarify that at this point. As for how big the subcommittee would be in terms of numbers of seats, again, this report hasn't sought to define that, and I think there's space for us to say whether, for example, is it all the same members just meeting, essentially with a different hat on, or is it a smaller group? The only key thing is that we haven't at this point defined that all of the chairs of all the committees should be on that subcommittee. I would say it's unwieldy probably if you try and go there. But we have tried to say, I think, that you ought to, although I imagine this wouldn't be codified in the Constitution, I imagine, there would probably be an expectation that each of the political groups on the party would be making sure that their group leaders would be on certainly that overarching Strategy and Resources Committee, so that you've got a kind of a sense of all the member leadership being in that space, and potentially being at the Finance Subcommittee too, but that'll be a matter ultimately for the groups when they decide who to appoint onto their politically proportionate seats. So that's not a direct answer to your question because the report doesn't seek to define it. But if the committee are able at this point to give a steer as to what they would imagine being the better outcome, I think that is close enough to the spirit of the report for us to take a recommendation on it.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think it was just to help us in our future thinking, really. I want to thank you.
Councillor Gilligan.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question too, and it's about the Strategy and Resources Committee and actually what its powers are, if that's the right word. For example, I'm looking at an issue, climate change, which although it will sit in one of the committees, actually affects all the committees, so it is an overarching policy goal. If one of the committees makes a decision that is obviously not compliant with climate change, is that the role of the Strategy and Resources Committee to step in and interfere? Can it change the decisions made by another committee? I guess that's my kind of question.
We're going to come on a little later to the mechanism that's proposed in here for reviewing decisions after they have been made. The system proposed in here is, let's see what part of the report is it in. It's in section 13, and it does allow for the Strategy and Resources Committee to review a decision made by another policy committee, but only if a a plurality? Well, anyway, a significant minority of that committee, the policy committee, not the Strategy and Resources Committee, choose to refer that matter for a second look. So what I'm trying to say is the Strategy and Resources Committee under this proposal can't reach in and challenge something that another committee has done, but if a significant majority on that committee say, we think you should come and take a look at this issue, then the ratio proposed in section 13 is 40% of that committee, then they are able to refer it to the Strategy and Resources Committee for just such a look. I think what's envisaged in this report is that the Strategy and Resources Committee would deal with those cross-cutting issues or matters that might cut across in advance of decisions. So primarily by setting a budget framework via council and within its own remit itself, a budget and policy framework that requires committees to make decisions that fit within that framework. And so on something like climate policy, you would expect that they wouldn't be able to step outside the policy framework that made statements about how climate decisions affecting climate would be taken. And so if a committee was proposing to take a decision that stepped outside of that policy framework, it would no longer be within their remit to take. Is that clear? So they sort of set in advance the remit in which those committees could operate, and so if something cross-cutting comes up, the committee won't be able to deal with it itself. It'll need to ask the Strategy and Resources Committee to look, and maybe even to full council if it's outside of the policy framework set by full council.
Councillor Richards.
So this is just me thinking aloud, listening to Sue, who is also my oppo here today. Sorry, I meant my twin here today rather than oppo, because we keep saying the same things. But moving on from what Sue said about the leader may not have the skill set around finance because they have a skill set for being out and about. I'm just thinking about the membership of the Finance Committee, and if it's made up only of members of the Strategy and Resources Committee, they may not also be especially financially numerate, there we are, rather than literate. So it might be, for instance, for the Lib Dems that Mike is actually their finance guru, and for the Greens it would be Councillor Argencio, who is all things finance. Is there some way of making sure that the Finance Committee has people who that's the wrong finance, rather than people who've been put on it because they happen to be on Strategy and Resources? And I realise that's messing it up because the subcommittee is supposed to have its membership from the parent committee. But is there some way of doing something like that?
We will also have other members on there because we will need to make it politically proportionate, and we won't know what that is until after the election. But I think Sue's going to sort us out with this one, I hope.
No, I'm not. I was just going to say that one of the things that we sort of been thinking when we've been talking about it is that we would want our finance spokesperson on that committee, and the way we would have to do it would be to put them on the strategic committee and then onto the finance subcommittee. So actually that's one of the reasons why I asked the question about the size of the committee, because if the committee is restricted very much to chairs and just one or two others to make it proportionate, that might actually exclude the people who you most need and want on the finance committee, if that makes sense.
It actually makes perfect sense, and the problem is you wouldn't want that person to have the responsibility of having finance and the responsibility of chairing a policy committee, because that would just be a workload far too far. So we need, we can't say for sure at this moment in time where the split will fall in terms of that committee being politically proportionate, and if all parties would be able to put on their sufficient additional members to make that, to be able to put that finance person on there. So I think that is something that we do need to give some further consideration to, isn't it, in relation to how we get around that. And I know Alex has just been having a quick chat about that.
Yeah, I do apologise. I've zoned out of your conversation to just check how we might be able to propose a way of putting an amendment to this recommendation that might allow for a committee, a group of members that has responsibility for finance, that isn't necessarily drawn from the membership of the Strategy and Resources Committee, but that in all other respects functions as if it were a subcommittee. So the Strategy and Resources Committee oversees its work, is able to review its decisions and all those kinds of things. So I would say from discussion, we're confident that there will be a way to do that. And either that it would be a separate committee, but that we write into the Constitution clarity about how it would relate to the Strategy and Resources Committee in those fashions, or that it would be a subcommittee, but we specify in the Constitution either that it doesn't need to be drawn from the parent committee if that's possible, or a system of co-option and so on. But my preference is to say that we amend this recommendation to say that we're talking about where it says, and a standing finance subcommittee, I would say, to amend that to say a standing finance committee or subcommittee, essentially to give you that space, and with a steer from this meeting that what we understand is that the membership need not, the purpose is to make it so that the membership is not drawn from, necessarily drawn from the Strategy and Resources Committee. So if we simply amend it to a standing finance committee or subcommittee, that gives us space to act on what we're being given as a steer from this meeting. And if you want to add a clause in there that says, with membership not necessarily drawn from the Strategy and Resources Committee, that would be even clearer. And then as for whether or not they're chaired by the leader of the council, I think what we're saying is that subject to your vote, an amendment you could put in here was that with the former chaired by the leader of the council, so that you'd leave space for the council to determine the latter. So just to be really clear, for the benefit of Jay, if I have captured what the committee is looking for, then a member could choose to move the following amendment, that the recommendation 1B reads, a Strategy and Resources Policy Committee, including all policy committee chairs within its membership, with overarching responsibility for the policy and budgetary framework, and a standing finance committee or subcommittee, with membership not necessarily drawn from the Strategy and Resources Committee, with the former chaired by the leader of the council.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to do here is give us space to figure out how most neatly to deliver what is being asked for, in the absence of being entirely confident that I can just say to you now, definitely, oh yes, a subcommittee, but without members from the parent committee. I need to go away and check that.
Councillor Jones has been waiting a while. Councillor Alston, then Councillor Labour.
Thank you, Chair. Though I could see in a conceited way that I'd quite like to be chair of a committee and I'd quite like to be the chair of finances, I could see why that should not be allowed to exist. Not just because it's me, but I could see how I could usurp the financial role of the council to serve one committee. So I think we probably would need... So I do think that some safeguard does need to be put in there to make sure that the finance is proportionate and responsive to all the council's needs, not just the whim of one powerful person.
Thank you. I think that's actually right, not because it's you. I think we could, I think to make it, well, Penny was just saying it feels a bit clunky. I think if we just talk about the Strategy and Resources Policy Committee to be chaired by the leader with membership drawn from whatever the bit is about, including all the policy committee chairs, and then just keep it as a separate clause. There will also be a standing finance committee or subcommittee. But I do think with membership not necessarily drawn from the strategy and resources, but I do think it needs to include in there some comment about its decisions being, you know, being responsible to the strategy and resources committee, if you see what I mean, for its decisions.
On reflection, I absolutely agree with you, that it should say as a standing finance committee or subcommittee reporting to the strategy and resources committee, I think would be the way to put that. And on reflection, we don't need to say about anything about its membership. If we don't need to say not necessarily drawn from. If we simply don't define it, that has the same effect. So that's a bit neater, isn't it?
No, thanks. I'm just reflecting on that's a really, I think, useful and informed discussion about kind of how we, in the current financial position of the council, handle some of the difficulties we've got. So thank you for that. I suppose my other reflection of what I heard from you as well was, and this is probably not for the recommendation, but you made a strong point there that I think we might want to minute for the design principles, which is you were talking about the importance of finance spokespeople being part of that, and I think that is a kind of underlying important principle of the group principle we've got that works for the committees that we probably need to capture as officers in what we design here in terms of who else is on that committee. So thank you. I would say that because I know how a budget process works.
So we have B. Oh, did you want to come in? Sorry.
Thank you. I think the chair of the finance subcommittee need not necessarily be the policy committee chair or the chair of the overarching strategy and resources committee, but should be on the strategy and resources committee in their own right and provide the necessary linkage and perhaps a vice chair as well, so that you have got that linkage between strategy and resources and finance. Thank you.
That makes perfect sense. Oh, Penny.
It does. So in the way that groups elect their leaders, they could select their chancellor, who could be on the Strategic and Resources Committee.
Chair, may I come in on this? One of the ideas that was discussed during the inquiry, which I think had some power to it, is this point that typically in committee system authorities, each group nominates a particular group spokesperson on each of the committees in the committee system, and those spokespersons take a particular role in the way that the committee is briefed, for example. So in advance of each committee, the spokespersons will gather with the chair and the vice chair, probably for briefings on certain issues that those spokespersons can then take back to their groups before a committee meeting takes place, that kind of thing. So I would expect that on both on strategy and resources and on any kind of finance committee or subcommittee, there would be such a spokesperson. Probably on the strategy and resources committee, that would in effect be the leaders of all the various groups. That would typically be how that would operate, but not necessarily. Just so that all the group leaders are all in one place at that kind of top-level decision-making committee. And at the finance space, of course, you nominate as your spokespersons your group representatives with the most passion for financial matters and knowledge in that matter.
So, nobody else? I think we're clear about the first part, that we need that to say that a Strategy and Resources Policy Committee, including all policy committee chairs within its membership, with overarching responsibility for the policy and budgetary framework is chaired by the leader of the council. So we're all there with that. I think we need a B part 1, which says,
I think it is simply a standing finance committee or subcommittee reporting to the Strategy and Resources Committee. I think that's it. It doesn't say anything about who would chair it or its membership. What that may in effect do is, if it becomes a committee rather than a subcommittee, it may in effect be another policy committee, but we'll cross that bridge. So I think we're clear what the intention is, and it leaves space for us to come back to you with some detail around who would chair it, how would it fit, etc., in the next round.
Are we all content with that? So we have 1B, as I just read out. Oh, I do, yeah, sorry. I need a proposer for...
I'll propose that.
Thank you, Councillor Dale, and seconded by Councillor Alston. Thank you. So 1B, all those in favour?
Should we say, yeah, so the amendment is to amend both 1B,
Sorry, yeah. We are amending 1B to finish it framework and add chaired by the leader of the council, and then we are adding 1B1, which is the standing finance committee or subcommittee, which is responsible to the strategy and policy committee.
So we're voting on the amendment proposed, and then after that we'll vote on the substantive motion as amended if the amendment is carried.
So we'll go with 1BI amendment first. All those in favour? Thank you. That is everyone. And then the 1B
as amended.
All those in favour, please. And again, that's everyone.
Shall I go on to 1C? During the inquiry process, we heard some amazing recollections from councillors who had been around during the previous iteration of a committee system at this council. And I made a statement that if we had 27 plus subcommittees to any one committee, I would consider that to have been a personal failure. But that's not the only reason why in this report you've got a recommendation here to contain the number of subcommittees through process. It's because during the inquiry you also heard important statements about one of the things that makes a modern committee system modern is that the authority vested in each of the committees is trusted to that committee, and that you keep that streamlined and avoid an over-proliferation of subcommittees and so on. One of the many things that makes a modern committee system different to that old way of doing things. So, it is important that it's possible to set up subcommittees. You can't ever legislate for what events may transpire. But the idea is that, as per recommendation 1C, full council would be required to agree the setting up of any subcommittee of a committee, rather than committees being able to go off on their own and set up various subcommittees for their own purposes. So it's really just a way of checking that it really, really definitely is necessary. The recommendation also refers to task and finish groups. So the idea is that a proposal comes back to the committee specifying kind of limits on how many temporary subject-specific inquiries can be run at any one time by all of these policy committees. This is simply for matters of capacity, officers and members. We can't have 30 odd different inquiries running at once. These are somewhat analogous to scrutiny committees doing detailed policy work to make pre-decision recommendations. And as you all know, we expect in the new world that on certain particularly complex critical matters, committees will want to do more than just have a briefing, give a steer in advance of a meeting. They'll want to get right into the weeds of the detail of a matter. And sometimes it might be appropriate for the whole committee to do that, but often it'll be most effective for a time-limited, subject-specific task and finish group to be set up to report back to a committee. So that's more or less what this is proposing, that we come back to you with some clarity about what those limits might be, a proposal based on officer resources and so on, and you can take a view on that, but that is the mechanism proposed for kind of containing the risk of proliferating separate bodies.
Thank you. Councillor Garbutt.
Thank you, Chair. Couple of questions. First one is about how the full council would authorise these. Would it be to say at the beginning of the year, no committee should have more than 2 task and finish groups operating at any one time, 2, 3, 4, whichever the number it is? Or would it be on an individual basis, say, if a committee wanted to have a new one, apply to full council for authorisation for that, or a mixture of the two, or some other way maybe? I'm just curious as to how that would work.
Thank you. So currently, what would be the approach for a group of interested councillors within a committee to have informal meetings, to then maybe go to the committee chair on which they serve to put forward a proposal that committee then has a working group on something of interest, probably cross-party or otherwise, and then would that committee then ask full council for permission to set up a subcommittee? Is that the mechanism that I think we'd see is working here? There's different approaches here as to how things could operate, and there's not always need for support for officers, for us elected members, to have a knockabout of ideas to then come to a consensus to go to the committee. I'm trying to work on how we do that, so any clarification would be good.
I think I should clarify because, to my mind, both questions need the same clarification from me. So I want to be really clear about what I mean is different between a subcommittee of a committee and a task and finish group. So the proposal here is that a subcommittee, which I would see as a effectively permanent until later stood down a body that is set up to exist in perpetuity as far as you can see when it's first set up. An example might be, we think we need a standing subcommittee because we have so many, I don't know, street scene issues coming through this committee that's too distracting. We want a separate subcommittee to deal with those whenever they come up, and they'll meet frequently or whatever. I really hope that doesn't happen, by the way, but that's sort of an example of the kind of thing you might set up a subcommittee for. A task and finish group, in my view, is not a subcommittee. It's not even necessarily a formal meeting, although you might choose to hold it in public and so on. And what it is a officer-supported, temporary, you could call it working group if you like, but investigation into a specific issue with the purpose of reporting back to the main committee for them to then take a formal decision on that matter with the benefit of the knowledge and input and steer that task and finish group has put together. So the proposal here is that if you want a standing subcommittee, you would need full council's approval to do that. And yes, I imagine that it would be a case of an issue arises, a committee says, do you know what, this is serious enough and it's having enough of an impact on our business, we're going to need to write a report to full council saying, please may we have a standing subcommittee on X, Y, Z, and that would be council to then approve. And then subsequent years, when council agrees its structure at the beginning of the year and appoints members to it, it would presumably reiterate those subcommittees. I don't imagine any council approval needed for setting up a task and finish group. I'd imagine that would be something a committee could do under its own steam. But we want to come back to you with a proposal for functional limits on how many of those can go on at once. Whether it's, each committee can run 1 or 2 at a time, or probably just 1 at a time or 2 at a time, or if it's there can be 9 at once across all the committees, you know, and I don't know, some kind of coordination needs to be made to make sure that they're happening in the right areas. So we'll want to come back to you with a proposal for that. But the key thing here is to say committees can't set up their own subcommittees, and we think there should be some kind of functional limit on the number of task and finish groups, but that they should be a mechanism available to members to use. The last thing is, of course, there's no limits whatsoever on members meeting in their own time without the support of officers to come up with whatever they like. Yeah, we're not trying to make any restrictions on that.
Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Chair. When we talked about subcommittees and having to be agreed by full council, sounds extremely sensible. When we said once you've got a subcommittee, it's there, could we say something about that when full council adds to, you know, puts people on subcommittees or whatever each year, that each year reviews whether those subcommittees are still needed, such that you might, so that, you know, if we're saying this is a living, breathing, documenty thing, you know, subcommittee, I don't know, children going to the poorhouse is probably one we wouldn't have anymore, but it's always there. It's like, I think we had something in our governor's constitution about a needlework committee, which in the end I said, why have we got this? And everybody said, we don't need it. So can we just say that every year we will review the subcommittees as to whether they are still needed, so that we don't have this proliferation?
Do we need that in the proposal as an amendment?
Yes, I'd like to propose that. I mean, it doesn't take very long to review, but it just makes sense that we're mindful of it each year. Yes, I assume that there'll have been a discussion beforehand, and then there'll be a proposal as to whether it continues or not.
Councillor Jones then, Councillor Baker.
I guess there would be the opportunity for full council to make any subcommittees or proposals of subcommittees time limited to ensure that there's a focus on reporting back work. I'm not sure whether we'd write that in there, that we consider that as a way of making sure that there is a focus on the work stream, and that, because I'm kind of concerned that a subcommittee could become a permanent feature, and then as such would it not warrant its own committee status if that was to become the case. So maybe they should be time limited in some way, or as part of that review process that could engineer in some kind of limit on them of a time nature.
Thanks, Chair. Shannon, you make a really sensible suggestion there. You do. We've got so many committees that we don't seem to be able to get rid of that don't actually function anymore. And over the years, I know officers have made a real effort to get rid of some and find out whether others function. So it would be a good idea that if we had something in place that we could say that they are reviewed, possibly as part of the AGM, you know, when officers are going through and sorting out memberships of things, and it's just part of that. And it's a simple question to the chair of the committee, does this subcommittee still function? Do you still want this? And then the decision is made, and we don't get clutter-bugged, because we can end up with a lot of clutter about things we need. I mean, some of the really good works happened in test and finish groups. I'm looking at Dawn because we worked on one together, and it was amazing what it came out with, street scene in Sheffield. And it's amazing the work that's happened there. So we don't want to discourage it. What we don't want is actually what Councillor Richards has said, that, you know, we keep things on our books that we don't really need. And we don't want to chair and say, well, we'll keep that one in case we need it. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things that are set up to do a job. And when that job is completed, it's ticked off. And it could be as much as a tick box, you know, that could pass through. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I would support what everybody's said. I think, you know, we have to be careful. What is a subcommittee compared to a task and finish group? Task and finish groups, I think committees will police their own numbers of task and finish groups. I think that's fine. You would have to have a really, really good reason for a subcommittee, which the council then would consider. And there would be a time limit, and it might be, we don't know what subcommittees might emerge or people might propose as over time. But there would be there is a need for it to be reviewed at some point. If the governance committees to continue, I don't know how long it will continue for. That would be maybe a place where things like that would be reviewed before it went to full council for the formal decision making. But if there's a proposal for a subcommittee, then there must be a really, really good reason for them to think that that's what is needed rather than a task and finish. So with the right processes in place, I think I'd support everything that was said.
Councillor Levery.
I'd just like a little bit of clarity on task and finish groups. We're talking about limits and on the number and frequency. I think the object of pre-decision scrutiny is to have a clear understanding of what the major decisions are that are coming up for the council and them rooted in the right direction to the appropriate policy group to set up a task and finish group to determine how that should go forward, if you understand what I mean. So to me, it's not just something that happens on the spur of the moment. There's an element of planning in this. What are the major decisions? Let's give you an example. Leisure and entertainment is coming up for renewal, and what's going to happen, and that to me will be a classic task and finish group that will look at what the options are going forward and give a steer to officers on how and what things should be investigated and come back on. So I'm not sure it's about limiting the number. I think it's more about clarity on understanding what the things are that will become referred to a task and finish group. Thank you.
So I suppose the question following on from that is, are we actually wanting to put a limit on the number of task and finish groups, more around making sure that we have the support to make sure that they function, as opposed to anything else?
I don't think we should put a limit, because I do think committees will police themselves. We've got a number of people sat on a committee and they will know what their workload is and what they can cope with. And a task and finish group might sit for X number of weeks or a couple of months, depending on how they want to gather evidence. I don't think we should say now it should be X number. But I think it should be constantly under review about what the committees are doing. If task and finish groups proliferate on one committee, I think questions would then arise about what the reasoning is for those. But I think, we've got to trust committees to judge for themselves about task and finish groups.
So, for the purposes of this recommendation, we have in there to be defined the number of task and finish groups. So, are we okay for today to leave that as is, that aspect, and look at that at some point in time? And to pick up on the point that I think Councillor Richards made first, do we need to add something as an amendment, provision for the full council, but not individual committees, to agree the addition of subcommittees to this structure, and then add, when the subcommittee is agreed, it is either time limited or reviewed annually as part of the AGM. And then the rest of the points each continue on from there. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to deal with the subcommittees in the first part of it and the task and finish groups in the second part of it.
I think that does work. What I'm just weighing up is the commitments being made in this report, and I was just trying to find where, and I couldn't find it just in time, but for there to be a review 6 months after this is put into place. And members have been quite clear, I think, that the governance committee would be, as per Appendix 1, still in existence and carrying out such a review. And we keep saying we think that this will be a live issue for years to come, we'll keep, needing to review and react to circumstances and so on. So I envisage the Governance Committee continuing to exist for a long time in order to carry out that function amongst others. And I would have thought that taking a look at the number and effectiveness of subcommittees would be part of that committee's standing responsibilities, and that they would therefore be making those recommendations to council to kind of give consideration to the necessity for those every time they are keeping in mind the effectiveness of the whole system. So I'm just trying to think about whether, I think what you're saying in your proposed amendment there, Chair, I don't know if you proposed it, but what you were suggesting as the amendment, is fine. It says that either they're set up as time limited or full council reviews them at its AGM. That leaves space, I think, for the recommendation to council to have come from the Governance Committee, so which I assume it would, but it doesn't define that yet. So if you're content that we leave it as that at this point, that the amended recommendation, if carried, would say council will review them at its AGM, and doesn't specify whether the Governance Committee has a role in that, we can come back to you with some detail that might propose that in due course. Does that sound like it's in the spirit of what you're discussing?
Councillor Lavery, then Councillor Dale.
Thanks, Chair. I'm absolutely fine with full council on subcommittees. That's not a problem. I don't understand why task and finish groups shouldn't be accountable to the Strategy and Resources Committee, who have that responsibility for overseeing what happens in the policy committees and challenging what happens in terms of task and finish and whether they're appropriate and whether that should sit there rather than full council. Thank you.
Chair? So just to be absolutely clear, the proposal specifically doesn't give full council any kind of role in defining what task and finish groups would be set up. So that role stays with the individual committees to define what task and finish groups they set up. They can react to their own work programme and events to consider where they want to put their resources. What we're saying in this recommendation, where we're saying that there's limits to be defined on the number and frequency that could be of those task and finish groups that could be carried out at any one time, I want to come back to you with some specifics on that, because ultimately it needs to be defined by the organisation's capacity to support you. So if every committee says we've got 6 or 7 things that we all want to put task and finish groups into, we want to run them all at once, we're not going to be able to support you to do that. And so I think we're going to be having a lot of conversations. Watch out for the phrase menu of options. I think you're going to hear that a lot. When you're looking at your forward plan of work as individual committees, you're going to be asked to think about your menu of options. What do we need to do in preparation for each of these issues, depending on how complex it is, depending on the degree and scope of public and stakeholder engagement you want to make sure has happened into that issue before you make the decision, and so on. And for some, but not the majority, you'll say a task and finish group is what we need on that. Committee can set that up under its own steam, but we will need to be coordinating with members. Well, you can set that one up then, as long as that task and finish group has finished, because we need that officer to be supporting it, and they won't be free till that committee's finished that task. Do you see what I mean? So we need there to be some kind of scheme that limits how many. Something I've done at a previous authority, for example, is had a 1 in, 1 out rule. So, you've got about roughly one task and finish group per committee total, and you can't set up another one until you finish the last one, which is quite a practical way of organising it. But like I say, I want to come back to you with that. Today's recommendation just agrees to the principle of there being limits on the number of task and finish groups.
Looking at it from a selfish point of view, there will also only be a certain amount of time we will all have as members to attend task and finish groups as well. So I think understanding that there is only so many we can facilitate and so many we can attend is probably reasonably sensible. But are you okay with that as an explanation, Councillor Lavery? Councillor Dale.
Thank you. I'm not sure about the AGM being the right point in the year to make decisions and review on subcommittees. As at the AGM, we're just coming into new positions potentially, and the committees won't have met and looked at their work programme before the AGM, if that makes sense. So it's going to take a while for a committee to discover whether or not and what they need a subcommittee for. My concern then is how long, because we're going to talk about full council coming up, how long would then have to wait to put a request into full council for a subcommittee? So I'm not I think once we're rolling, maybe, you know, but I think for this year, I'm not sure whether the AGM, and is there somewhere further on in the year where we could put the decision around subcommittees in? I'm just because if it is work that's going to come up, so there are some portfolio areas where you know you're going to need subcommittees for that, and you're going to, but there are other areas like you said, something might crop up as part of that workload. How swiftly then will that committee be able to get the request in? And if we're going to say a couple of months, is that speedily enough? So I'm just, yeah.
Which then leads us to the question, what happens to the subcommittees that are running up to the AGM?
Chair, I think I can see a path through this one. As I understand it, the amendment that you're considering voting on is to say that the AGM will review the standing subcommittees and consider whether any need to be stood down. But I don't think you've put any restriction on when full council can consider a request to add one. So I assume that you're not having to wait until the next AGM before you can add a subcommittee if council agrees. So hopefully that deals with that issue.
So 4C then, we are going with, as an amendment, the provision for full council, not the individual committee, to agree the addition of subcommittees to this structure. When the subcommittees are agreed, they are time limited or they are reviewed annually as part of the AGM, and then it continues until it meets to the end. I'm happy to propose that if somebody wants to second it. Thank you, Councillor Garbett. We're just about to vote. Perfect timing. We're going with the amended add-in that we discussed earlier. Amendment, yeah, the amendment add-in to add in after the committee structure. When agreed, the subcommittees are time limited or they are reviewed annually as part of the AGM. That's an amendment I've proposed and has been seconded by Councillor Garbett. All those in favour? So we're okay with that as the substantive motion. Thank you. So we now have the amendment C. So we now have the substantive motion C as amended. All those in favour, please. That's everyone. Thank you. Dean.
Shall I continue point by point? Okay, so I'm conscious of time, but I think this is productive so far. Apologies, members. You might be, I hope you don't have things booked for immediately after the 2-hour meeting. Let's see what we can do, eh? So item 1D. So this essentially asserts that the 7 local area committees continue to exist and specifically makes a recommendation that they would be linked to the policy committee with responsibility for communities. So this is not closely defined as to what linked to means in this report, but it is taken to mean that when a local area committee has an issue that it wants to escalate on the basis that, for example, it needs a decision made that is outside of its own purview, or wants to raise an issue for strategic citywide attention that has come to its attention at a local level, that kind of thing, I think the proposal here is designed to say that that kind of work would be conducted through one of the policy committees, and that would be the one which had responsibility for communities, on the basis that that committee is likely to be overseeing sort of a strategy, a community strategy for the whole city, and to be plugged into the mode of operating for local area committees and so on. It's important if we're going to have a debate on whether that is the right way for the local area committees to link into the committee system, to bear in mind that it's not about the local area committees being in any way subordinate. They are separate committees set up by full council under their own right. It's about referring issues across between committees of one sort, local area committees, to committees of another sort, which is strategic policy committees. So we're talking about what is their route in terms of links to when they want to raise a strategic issue to the policy committees.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Austin, then Councillor Garbutt.
Thank you. In terms of the local area committees, I think there is a feeling that they should not just report through the communities committee. I mean, to make an obvious example, at the minute, fly tipping is one of the things that LACs have got specific funding for. So if they find any issues that they think are city-wide issues, surely that should be able to go straight to the waste and whatever it's called, waste and street scene committee, rather than having to go via something else. So I think that's something we feel quite strongly about. The other thing is that the LAC Chairs Committee is conspicuous by its absence in the diagrams, and I think that actually has an important role to fill and probably should have that recognised within the recorded structure of the council.
Thank you. Councillor Garbutt.
Yes, I was going to say much the same thing. I think that the LAC Chairs Committee should play an important role here, and it could be through that committee that issues get passed to the appropriate committee. That would play a role both of making sure that 6 or 7 of the LAC committees aren't passing similar things on and making it very piecemeal. It all goes to the to the LAC Chairs Committee, and they would pass it on to the appropriate committee as a city-wide problem, rather than 6 or 7 local issues. I think there's also a role there in terms of making sure that all the concerns of the LACs are in one place. And I think there's also a role for the LAC Chairs Committee in passing information from committees to LACs in terms of decisions made that might affect the LACs. So I think that's an important committee to have noted in the diagram, and if we need to, I would propose that be the conduit through which issues are passed either way.
Thanks, Chair. It's been said right from the start that the LACs are the principal way which the council will communicate and talk and consult and engage with the communities around Sheffield, the people of Sheffield, and things will come down from the council for us to consult our local communities on, and also things that are discussed in local area committees with the public. They will bring things for the committees to discuss, and I hope that they do bring ideas and proposals for our committees to look at, not just questions, not just at public questions, but meaty things for us to look at. And I think if these items that we need to discuss, and that needs then to go across, not up, but across to a committee, we should decide that. I think the chairs, with advice, can decide which committee that would go to. And indeed, it might go to more than one committee. It might cover a number of committees. So obviously a bit more work there, but that would, that could be the case as well. And things will go down to as I say, from committees to the LACs, to a LACs chair group for discussion and then dissemination. It might be that all 7 committees agree, all 7 LAC areas agree there's something that's worthy of going to a committee, or it might be one committee that will bring it to a chairs group, and then. But I think we have to lay the foundation that it's not just all 7 committees that have to agree, but it would come from one committee, and that will go to, with a discussion with the chairs, go to a committee that is relevant, and that will be discussed at a LAC chairs meeting about which committee that would be, or 1 or 2, as I say. I also think that the minutes, that record what people are saying out there, need to be there for everybody to have a look at and everybody to refer to, and they should go to full council for noting.
Councillor Garbett.
Yes, I think it's also worth noting that using the LAC Chairs Committee would be a quicker way of getting information going in either direction. I think that we want a modern committee system which is agile, etc., and I think that would provide a little more agility than passing from one LAC to one committee. I think that might take some time, and when LAC chairs are meeting much more often, then that would be much quicker.
So I think the thing that we're all agreed on is that we shouldn't be sending everything to the Communities Committee, as is in the recommendation. So the issues then that we just need to get clear about, are we saying that we want the information from the individual LAC to go to the LAC chairs and then to the relevant committee? I just...
Okay, so members, this one gets a little bit complicated. I've just had a discussion with my legal services colleague, Sarah, about how do we handle this idea of a LAC chairs committee. The reason it's not in the diagram is because although currently there is a informal meeting of the chairs of the local area committees that takes place regularly, it is not a formal committee. It's not a formal committee of the council or anything along those lines. It's a tremendously useful space for discussion and coordination of how those local area committees are working, so that the chairs are keeping in touch with each other. And they make what I would consider to be sort of informal decisions about, let's all deal with things in this way or that way, and then each of the chairs takes that to their committees. But if you want to make that a formal committee, we need to go through the usual considerations. So political proportionality is one, which means that we need to consider how we would create a committee that had the chairs of the local area committees on it that still fitted with proportionality as far as that was necessary. What I think we want to do is we want to take away to have a look at how we could have a group that does what the committee is asking for, that chairs can use to coordinate the way that they operate, whether there is a way to make that formal, whether there is a necessity to make that formal. It could meet publicly without being a formal committee, as long as it's not taking formal decisions. But we just need to be really clear how we're making that a formal committee and what the implications would be of doing so, if that's the intention. The other comment I suppose to make is we're talking about it speeding things up by having this an intermediary committee whereby any recommendation from a policy committee to a local area committee has to go to this intermediary committee first, and any recommendation from a local area committee to a policy committee has to go to this intermediary group first. It doesn't sound obviously to me like that would necessarily speed up the connections between those things, although I can see that it could help coordinate the connections between those things. And honestly, I think that probably that coordinating role was what was expected in this proposal to be done by the Communities Policy Committee. So if you wish that coordination to be happening in a different space, then we can definitely explore what space that should be. but I would hesitate to recommend that you add another committee into this structure just for the purpose of coordinating the links between local area committees and the other committees. It doesn't sound streamlined to me. And the LAC chairs, very important that they continue to meet. I would suggest they continue to meet informally, and I do think it should be possible to write into the Constitution a role for them, that they exist, that they will meet, that they will consider how to deal with issues coming forward and so on, but without giving them formal decision-making authority, that they can then take away into each of their local area committees a collective view on how to handle issues that are coming from policy committees and so on. So if it's fine if you want to vote down the recommendation that says they're linked to the policy committee with responsibility for committees, no problem. If you want to say something more specific than that, such as that the local area committee chairs have a role in the coordination of referrals from local area committees to the strategic committees and vice versa, to be, with proposals to be defined by officers and brought back or something like that. I think I could work with that, but I would I guess I would warn against resolving today to set up a new committee of the local area chairs, because I think there's some complexity there to be ironed out.
Thank you. I've got a number of people wanting to come in, and this may be the point somebody wants to ask, but if we don't formalise it within the structure, does that mean the LAC chairs could meet just as LAC chairs and not be politically proportionate? And that if we want to put them into the structure formally, we somehow need to make that committee a politically proportionate structure?
Yes, we think so. If I'm really honest, I want to check. I know that, for example, you can agree parts of your structure that do not obey the rules of political proportionality if you have what's called a NEMCON vote at full council, which means no councillors object to the recommendation for how seats will be apportioned. But that's not a very reliable way to plan your entire structure. You only need one councillor to sort of put their hand up, and you've kind of wrecked the whole principle on which you're designing your structure. There may be another way, which we hadn't anticipated needing to consider, so I don't want to go on record here specifying what that would be. I'm happy to take a steer from the committee that says there needs to be a role for the LAC chairs in that process, and that it wouldn't be specifically just the policy committee with responsibility for committees that would, communities that would take that role. But I guess I'm warning you against, or I'm asking you perhaps not to go further than that in defining it today, to give us some space to get that right.
I've got a bit of a list: Councillor Alston, Councillor Leveray and Councillor Lee.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, who knew? I think what we're really wanting is for the LACs to be able to refer to an appropriate policy committee any issues that they feel need to be passed on. If that goes via an informal discussion of LAC chairs, so be it, because they may be able to give better evidence to the policy committee. But what I think we're saying is that it shouldn't all go through Communities Committee, which will then decide to pass it on to another committee and 2 months later. So I would prefer personally that it said that the local committees have the ability to refer to the policy committees. And maybe for this stage leave it at that, but bear in mind that we would like the LACs chairs to exist however we can manage to make it exist.
It feels like you're wanting them to be a subcommittee of the Communities Committee, but that can't take place in that role unless the chair of the LACs sits on the Communities Committee and therefore has that role. So I think this is a fairly complicated area. We need to get this clearly defined, but I'm certainly with Councillor Alston on this one. We need to get this right. Thank you.
I think Councillor Alston has said we want LAC chairs to be able to refer to the relevant committee, not just through one committee, it needs to go to the relevant committee. whatever the proposals or suggestion might be. There is a protocol in place for a request to devolve things down, and equally, I'm sure that would apply to proposals going to a committee as well. So that there is a mechanism in place. In terms of the chairs, it's an informal committee now with it, and that means that there's a wide and relevant discussion on any items that are brought. And it is proportional because the voters have decided how they want to proportion their votes, and so each committee is proportional, politically proportional if you like, and the chairs in the same way. There was a discussion a while back, and I don't know where it went, that maybe the chairs of committees should take a role in some of the other things that are happening on the council, so maybe a health and wellbeing board, or I'm not sure, I don't want to start throwing random proposals in now, but that was part of a discussion some while back, and I mean, I don't know how relevant that is now, so maybe that's, somebody can give that one some thought at some point, but it's not for this group now to discuss. In terms of a separate part of that, I think it should be something you should take away and discuss, and not decision now.
Conscious of time, Chair, can I make a suggested amendment then that one of you may wish to propose specifically? Can I propose a wording for it? Apologies.
Your Chair, everybody said what I wanted to say.
So forgive me, I'm going to try and put words in your mouth, and if any of you thinks this is right, you can propose it. So I think a reword of 1D might be 7 local area committees with a mechanism to allow for referrals between them and policy committees as necessary, and regular informal meetings of local area committee chairs to ensure effective coordination.
Chair, I'm happy to propose if...
Somebody second? Peter? Thank you. So that is the amended proposal. Amended proposal. All those in favour, please. That is everyone. Thank you. So, as a substantive, are we all happy with that as a substantive proposal? Agreed. Everybody in favour? Yeah. Thank you. Richards.
So this isn't something I have...
Councillor Lee.
Oh, sorry.
Well, quite exciting, wasn't it? This isn't something I've mentioned to anybody before. It's just something that's dawned on me or I've thought of. Under E, at the moment we have the Governance Committee, which is a new committee. And in other authorities, I know that governance usually comes under audit, and I recognise that we may want to have a governance committee for a year just because we're busy looking at all the changes that we're going through, but whether it might at some stage make more sense to have audit and governance as a committee so that you've got it neatly in one place where it's a space that is non-political or not party political in that sense, where you've got a safe space to put governance, that's all. I don't think you have to agree it or anything today. I'm just floating it as something that people might want to consider, because it would mean one less committee in our bonfire of the committees.
Councillor Garbutt.
Yes, totally different point from Councillor Richards. At the moment we have a licensing committee, we have planning committee, and we have admissions committee, all of which make decisions, and that's good. But they don't actually have an input into any of the policy of those areas. Are we proposing then that the policy for those areas fall under some of the policy committees? And in which case, what's the standing for those particular committees?
So So insofar as the powers relating to policy for planning and so on were previously covered by members of the executive, my understanding is that that power will transfer to a policy committee rather than to the regulatory committee with responsibility for planning decisions. But honestly, I'm not aware that it's been discussed, so I can come back to you with we will come back to you with clarity about that when we come back with the detail, but I don't think there's been anything beyond that specified at this point.
Is there anything else you want to add about?
I don't want to prolong things, but I was just trying to hurriedly find it. Sinead, I'm aware, sorry, Councillor Richards, I'm aware that there is, forgive me, there is some guidance out there, and it might be SIPFA possibly, that's been produced that's specifically about the relative merits of combining audit with either governance or standards, and the risks of doing one or the other or what have you. So we can dig that out and explore it in due course, but I'd agree perhaps not something for just yet. Yeah, but it is out there, some specific consideration of it.
Any more comments on E, or are we happy to take a vote on that recommendation? All those in favour, please show. That's carried.
F. So this is the subject of urgency. Now, for the benefit especially of anyone who's watching and for members who aren't so familiar with processes we use at the moment, we currently have defined in our constitution at least two different types of urgency, different degrees of how urgently does this decision need to be taken, and to what extent we are willing to use different rules about who can take a decision based on how urgent that matter is. And for example, in situations of extreme urgency, in the current arrangement you would have the chief executive able to simply take a decision, and she would be required, of course, to make an attempt to consult with the leader and then to report back to members about what she did and why and so on. So the important thing to start with is there is an existing framework for urgency that includes officer decision making at a certain point, and also includes, under the current arrangement, individual councillor decision making, principally in the case of the leader of the council. So what we're talking about here is in a situation where individual councillors can no longer take decisions, and where you've got committees who typically would expect to be making a decision on a subject, no matter how urgent it is, how do we propose to adapt our urgency procedures to attempt to keep decisions as far as possible and to the degree that it's appropriate in the member domain? So we assume that there will continue to be the times when something is so urgent that an officer will need to just take a decision after attempting to contact whichever relevant members they would, chairs of committees and so on, to consult with them and to report back to members and explain their actions afterwards. This is something that most councils had hardly ever done until COVID hit, and then many councils found themselves needing to rely on this for months. So we do have precedent for this function being used recently in Sheffield, to great and significant effect, I should add. The proposal here is that when things are not quite that urgent, but are too urgent to wait 1 or 2 months until the next scheduled meeting of a decision-making committee, that there might be in this model a subcommittee of each committee, presumably scheduled to meet on the intervening months, but only if required by the arrival of something urgent, and otherwise they simply would cancel that meeting, and constituted of a smaller number of members so that they are agile and able to meet quickly, and probably with a smaller quorum, so that it requires fewer members to be able to turn up at short notice in order to be able to make that decision. The smaller quorum is the key thing, really. It needs to stay politically proportionate, of course, and that will define to an extent what size that subcommittee might be. But to give members an idea, the functional minimum for any committee is 3 members, And I would anticipate that in order to maintain a suitable degree of political proportionality, that you could expect that a committee to be at minimum somewhere between 3 and 5 members, I would have thought. There are other options, of course, as you've heard in your inquiry process, such as having one committee set up separately which deals with any urgent decision for any other committee, or to have, for example, your overarching committee, your strategy and resources committee, able to take all of those urgent decisions on behalf of the other committees. Neither of those is proposed here, the idea being that it's better to, as far as possible, keep the decision-making inside the committee itself, where the members, the chair of that committee and the members on it are best informed about that subject area. So having a subcommittee of the committee itself able to take an urgent decision was an attempt to keep that decision-making as close as possible to the original committee that have responsibility for that issue. There is also a proposal here that says that, to essentially along the lines of trying to keep things as streamlined as possible and to, wherever possible, keep decisions made by members but without setting up extra meetings, that if something urgent came up for a policy committee just in the week or two preceding a scheduled meeting of the Strategy and Resources Committee, that perhaps we could specify with the agreement of the chair of that policy committee, the Strategy and Resources Committee would be able to take that decision for them. But only under those urgent circumstances, I think, would be the expectation, and only in consultation with the chair of that committee. So that's a mechanism that's supposed to help avoid needing to set up special, separate, urgent meetings when you've also got those other meetings scheduled. But that, I would say, is a sort of an extra part of the puzzle. The subcommittees is the key mechanism proposed.
Thank you, yeah. Generally sort of happy with this proposal, but just a bit of a concern about the need when we actually get to the detail to be very clear about when the Strategy and Resources Committee would take an urgent decision over and above the urgency committee of the relevant committee. Sorry, too many committees. Because I think it's really that the urgency committee of whichever one it is, whether, let's say it's children's, having to take an urgent decision, that should be, if at all possible, the group that meets to take that decision. And I think there needs to be a very clear hierarchy that only if that can't happen, should it then go to strategy and resources. And that obviously needs putting in the, when we come to the detail. But
I have Councillor Gilligan, then Councillor Dale.
Yeah, mine is just a question, really. Is the Strategy and Resources Committee also going to have an urgency committee? I'm just wondering if there is an urgent financial crisis that emerges. How does that happen?
Yes, so... Sorry, Chair, shall I come in? Yes, the Strategy and Resources Committee is envisaged as a policy committee. It is one of them. It just has a different set of roles. So yes, it should have its own urgency subcommittee.
Thank you. With regards to urgent decision making and that being really urgent to a point where it's got to go to an officer and in conversation with the chair, once that decision's made, how would a committee or councillors not challenge that decision but review that decision and the outcomes of that decision? I'm talking about how would that then be scrutinised? Where would people be able to ask the rationale behind that decision-making process?
I don't know what our current constitution says. We're not sure off the top of our heads about that process. I am confident that there will be a mechanism by which officers are expected to report, usually within a timescale, usually to full council, if they've taken executive decisions under an urgency procedure. Forgive me, I can't tell you what your current procedure is, but I expect that to translate forward into the future world, probably with very little need for change.
Thank you, Alex. I ask quite simply because who decides when it's urgent and what is the measure for an urgent decision to be made?
Again, the thresholds for urgency are currently clearly defined in the Constitution, and I would expect those to remain similar, if not the same, and that detail will come forward to members in due course.
I don't know why you would need strategy and resources to take urgent decisions, because if you've got an urgency committee, that can be convened at any time. And surely it's the members of that committee who you want to look at the urgency item rather than strategy and resources, which dilutes it because it isn't the members of that particular committee. And every member could be a member of the urgency subcommittee, and you just need to make sure that you've got proportionality of what the phrase is for when that urgency committee meets, so such that you've got people. And then I would assume that every time, if there is an urgency, an urgent item, that at the next meeting of that committee, there'd be a standing item on the agenda which says urgent items, and if there has been one, they would report back on it and what happened. So I don't see the need for strategy and resources to do it.
I think that refers back to the point that Councillor Alston made, doesn't it, about having a clear pathway through which you go. So that would always be the first point of call. But if for some reason that doesn't happen, there is a fallback of the Strategy and Resources Committee, I think is the... But if you wish to amend it, please speak now.
I'll just ask my twin over there what she thinks.
Chair, I think it would be helpful if we understood the rationale behind why it was written like this, why the option was given for both. Because the other question comes then, does it then go to the urgency committee of the Strategy and Resources Committee?
Chair, shall I come in then? Shall I come in? So this is an option which arose through the inquiry process. Forgive me, I can't remember off the top of my head which council mentioned that they had this mechanism in place, but it was the logic behind it was to basically minimise the number of separate meetings you have to set up. If you've got a meeting of your overarching committee coming up next week, it is less trouble, bureaucracy, impact on members, etc., to simply add an urgent decision to their agenda than to separately try and gather the members together for an urgent subcommittee at short notice. So it's about bureaucracy, I think, and keeping things moving swiftly. But Councillor Richards' point that says if you're anyway scheduling, got your penciled in subcommittee meetings in the same off month in which you're holding your overarching committee meetings anyway, your Strategy and Resources Committee meetings, I think it is also sufficient for the subcommittees to be the place where those decisions will be made. It appeals to officers like me to have more than one way to take an urgent decision in a way that keeps it in the member domain, so that we don't find ourselves stuck later, forced to get an officer to take the decision, even though there's a meeting happening tomorrow that's got lots of members in a room, just because we said that wasn't allowed, But if there's a reason, and I understand why it could be to do with, sovereignty of an individual committee, why you don't want that power to be there, then absolutely you can move to amend the recommendation and say that, specify that it would be subcommittees that would do it. But the amendment you mentioned earlier along the lines of asserting a primacy that says they can only do that at the Strategy and Resources Committee if there has been like a failure to set up a subcommittee of the main committee first, if that's been not practically possible to do, that might perhaps provide some reassurance about how it would be done.
Yeah, personally I think I'd be happy if it was a clear primacy, I think is the word you used, where it was very clear that the Strategy and Resources would only take that decision if for some reason we couldn't get an urgency committee together, like they'd all got COVID, for example.
Do we want to amend that, or are we happy that that can be written in at some point?
Oh, sorry. Does it need specifying now, so that we know that can we add an addendum somewhere that says we'd like it looked at a bit further.
So,
Rather, yeah.
So we'll take the amendment as it is, but we've got an action that is work that we would like to come back to the committee. Take the recommendation as it is and have an action to do some work to come back to the committee with further detail. Or do we want to amend?
Through Chair. The only amendment I would suggest, and I don't feel strongly about it at the minute, but for other policy committees if necessary, because if necessary would imply that they would only do that, well, if necessary. If necessary, you could then add to that because the urgency subcommittee was unable to meet, or it was able to meet in a timely way or in time. Now coming up with.
Anybody happy to second that amendment?
Yes.
What exactly is the wording?
So it's because the agency committee is unable to meet in a timely way.
In a sufficiently urgent time frame, maybe a better word.
Is able to meet in a. Thank you. Okay, all those in favour of the.
Would you do, might be a Jane in favour of reading out?
Yeah. So we are saying we're going to the end of F, and then we are saying because the agency committee is unable to meet in an appropriate time frame.
Urgency subcommittee.
Yeah.
Shall we say because the relevant urgency subcommittee has been unable to meet?
Yeah. Who's not added a word in? Okay. Got that, Jay. Sue and Sinead. Oh.
Sorry, I don't want to draw this out a bit, but then who decides what's the time, an appropriate time frame? Would we then have to put that into constitution again? Yeah, fair enough.
Absolutely. We'll draft all this up into a. There will be a process of drafting where we'll define all these specifics for you. The key thing from members is to define how you want it to work, and then we'll be able to define the detail for you. Yeah.
Okay, so the amendment, all those in favour? That's everyone. So we're happy with that as our substantive? Yeah. Thank you. H, no separate scrutiny committee. Oh, sorry, G, sorry. Time flies when you're having fun, sorry, G.
So members, I think the key thing to say about this is we need a starting point. You heard during the inquiry process, I think in some detail, that councils tended to find that their different policy committees met at different levels of frequency in the year. And you heard officers explaining that they'd essentially had to see what the business was like and adjust accordingly. And I was surprised, and I think some of you maybe were too, to hear how infrequently some of the policy committees actually found they needed to meet. Of course, you are splitting up decisions made by one group, cabinet, amongst 7 or 8 now, so that does kind of make sense on reflection. We have to start somewhere. When you get to the annual meeting in May, you have to have some programme to agree. So what is proposed here is a system whereby on 1 month you've got all of the policy committees, with the exception of the Strategy and Resources Committee, meet. The next month the Strategy and Resources Committee meets, allowing for referrals upwards, and then the next month you're back to all the all the policy committees again for any referrals downwards. And I think full council meetings would presumably fall on the same month as the policy committees, so that you've got sequential months, policy committee, strategy, resources committee, council, were things to escalate up through that process in that way. And so you've got a shorter gap between strategy, resources and council. So that's what's proposed here. The key thing to note, I think, is that 6 meetings a year of full council is a reduction on the number of meetings currently. And obviously we heard during the inquiry a few discussions about the relative merits of that. It is baked into some of the assumptions in here about members' capacity, that there would be fewer full council meetings. And since members will be engaged in meaningful decision-making in committee in a way that they haven't previously been, arguably that takes some of the role of where previously members' only opportunity to get involved in that kind of strategic decision-making may have been at, say, planning, licensing or full council. So that's their proposal as a starting point. To be really clear, the opportunity for extraordinary meetings will still exist through a relevant system, and you can expect the frequency of those meetings to be absolutely under review constantly as the system is tried out.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Alston, then Councillor Richards, then Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I think a concern about this suggestion is around the halving, actually, almost, of full council meetings. I think I'm going to propose, with the support of my colleagues, that we actually have 6 meetings of full council plus its AGM and plus its budget meeting. So that would actually be 8 meetings. And the reason is that we do feel very strongly that the public do see full council as the place to bring petitions, questions, and to have access. And yes, obviously they can go to policy committees, but and it may, over time, it may prove that that's what people prefer. But for now, we think we should stick with having extra meetings, because the AGM, to all intents and purposes, is just a formal meeting. So in particular, that shouldn't count as one of the 6. And the budget meeting is really quite different. And so our suggestion would be that we have 6 sort of routine council meetings plus those extra 2. Largely, as I said, because of the public's ability to access their councillors and have people held to account in front of all councillors.
Yes, if I am Lord Mayor next year, the idea of only having to chair 6 meetings of 84 lively people was very appealing. But once again, I agree with Sue that at a time when we're talking about increasing democracy and including the public, then to look as if, because I think it's the feel of it, isn't it? And the optics of it, as much as the actuality. It looks like we're leaving out the public, and public questions and public petitions are a huge part of our current full council, and I would argue more important than some of the resolutions that we pass at the end, because that's where the public, as you say, hold us to account, tell us what they think. And hard as that may be at times, it is absolutely crucial to our role as councillors. So I would support Councillor Alston.
So I agree, I think, with what's been said, so that's fine. On terms of council meetings, I think 8 is fine, because the AGM is just purely very, very formal and almost seems to be over and done with very quickly sometimes, and you hardly know you've been at a meeting. But in terms of the LAC committee meetings, I'd just like to include a word like formal in front of the 4 LAC committee meetings. I don't want to change the frequency, but we have talked in the Chairs Committee, and it's been raised by the public that the 4 meetings are not sufficient. So we've talked about having just very informal meetings in each ward if we choose to have those meetings, and that wouldn't. So there wouldn't be formal meetings. It'd just be it would be based on a ward issues, I guess, but with the LAC chair and the LAC committee, relevant LAC committee members there. So could we just include the formal in front of the four.
I've got Councillor Garbutt, Councillor Jones, Councillor Baker and Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Chair. It does occur to me that within all the totality of these proposals that there is nothing on access by the public to any of this process. And it may be at this point that, as Sue Alston has said, that we need to take into account the fact that full council meetings are at the moment the major way of accessing the public accessing the various decision-making processes. But is there anything that we need to say about how the public access or take part in any of the policy committees, for example? I'd like very much to be able to see something on that within here, and I don't see it at the moment. So I don't know if that requires a new, something new to put in, or an amendment to whichever of the paragraphs we've got here. But I think it's really important. We are, after all, responding to what the public has been saying for some time, and not to include the public would be perverse at this stage.
So I think I've heard a few things. So for starters, it sounds like there might be a proposal on the table, were it proposed and seconded, to amend this point to say a programme of 6 formal meetings a year of council, plus, or perhaps we say 8 formal meetings of council. Should we just say 8? So a proposal for 8 formal meetings a year of council and formal meetings of each policy committee, and 6 formal meetings of each policy committee, including the Strategy and Resources Policy Committee, and 4 formal meetings a year of each local area committee. So I think that's what we're looking at. 8, 6 and 4, all, obviously we're specifying formal if that's what you prefer. As for the mention of the public engagement, you're absolutely right. It's arguably the most important aspect of this whole thing. As you'll recall from the Chair's response to the public question at the beginning, we have a whole separate item on today's agenda about the progress of that work, what comes next and what to do with it. I think it's section 3.3 of this report specifies, and it's not covered in this report, in line with the committee's agreed approach to deal with the what first, get the framework in place, how many committees, how often they're meeting, so on and so forth, and then to deal with the how, the ways of working, public engagement and so on, all of which I think we all agree is more important than how many committees and so on, but that comes later, partly because of the way we've needed to iterate all the different parts of this design process simultaneously, and so on. So yeah, I don't think anyone disagrees, Councillor Garbutt, but this wasn't ever intended to be the place where that was spelt out. I think would be my response.
Sorry, folks. Obviously, Councillor Grocott had to go. She'll get back if she can. Hopefully she can. So if anybody else wishes to speak on this item, will they indicate, because I haven't got her list. So Councillor Jones and then Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Chair. I was kind of thinking that it may be helpful to say that the local area committees would meet on the month that the full council doesn't meet, because with the 8 full councils that we have and then local area committees meeting, that means there is a public forum for members of the public to engage council in some form or whatever on a monthly basis, so that effectively you could have the local area committee on a full council fallow month, effectively.
We could specify that. I think the only downside I can think of is that it puts the vast majority of our meetings on the same month every month. So we'd end up with 8 policy committees, and full council and 4 local area committees all happening in the same month, and then in the intervening month, I'm so sorry, I've got that wrong. I got that entirely wrong, haven't I, from what I said it would be. Sorry, forgive me. Yes, we could do that, but the point I need to make is that at each of the policy committees, it is assumed and not yet specified, because we haven't tried to get into that yet, that there will be a mechanism for public questions, presumably related specifically to what's on the agendas of those committees. But what that would mean is that it wouldn't be incumbent on the local area committees to fill in a gap. There would be an opportunity for some kind of public speaking at any meeting of a committee as well as full council. So that may mean that you don't need to specify when those local area committee meetings would take place, which may be a benefit from the point of view of allowing them to respond to local need and so on. So I would hesitate to specify if you can avoid it. And the other thing to just say is, I know this is difficult because we haven't got into it yet, but public questions at committees and council is one way of allowing the public to speak at you, but isn't a tremendously effective mechanism of public participation in democracy. And I think what's important is that we're going to look at how to do that better in various ways, so that you're not relying on questions at committees and council and so on as the only mechanism by which that is happening. So hopefully that is a reassurance on those points.
Thank you. I have to support what Sue has said. I think whilst we've talked about public participation, that will come. I think it's too early to remove that platform, as Sinead had said. I just think it's really important that if people have got a question or a petition, if that item's not being discussed on an agenda within a specific committee, then it needs to come to full council and be directed that way. And I think in full council, that is the opportunity for the public to have that conversation with the leadership. And that won't be in all of it. You know, the leader and chief officers are not going to be able to be in every single committee, whereas they will be at full council. And I think that's something that the members of the public need to know that they can do. And I think it's really important that we don't remove that too soon.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I was just going to make a very simple point that we should steer away from trying to be too prescriptive about which months everything happens in, because 3 years out of 4 we generally have to avoid April for reasons that most people can never quite get their heads around. And also we try to reduce the number of meetings that we hold in August, so I think we just need to be a bit careful about being too prescriptive. If everybody's happy, I'm quite happy to propose the amendment that for the 8, 6 and 4.
Because we've got Councillor Lee wishes to speak.
Just about LACs, I think the 7 LAC meetings, public meetings, 4 times a year. 7 separate LAC meetings 4 times a year, and they cannot meet on the same day. So they all need the equal amount of support and a number of officers that have to attend. So I just think, you know, we have to allow LACs to choose and make the best decisions in accordance with that and accordance with the support that they needed. So I think we need that flexibility.
So just to add myself, if we stick to 6 a year and we don't take the AGM and budget afterwards, it'll only be 5 opportunities a year for the members of the public to speak to the full council. So yeah, I think we need to, come on Sue, give us your...
So I was just going to offer to propose the amendment that I think Alex more or less suggested, which is that we change the 6 to an 8 meetings of the council and add in 6 meetings of each policy committee. And then add in the word formal, because Mary's absolutely right. Sorry, Councillor Lee is absolutely right. It was always said there would be a minimum of 4 formal meetings, but there may be other of each LAC. So that's an 8-6-4.
Have we got a seconder for that? Councillor Dale. All those in favour? Any against? Any abstentions? Thank you very much. Now you're going to have to bear with me for a minute. So, yeah, so sorry about that. Shall we vote? on the substantive. All those in favour? Any against? Any abstentions? There is not. Thank you. So we have H, which is no separate scrutiny committee. Don't speak to Alex.
I don't want to draw this out, councillors. You've heard lots of discussion about the importance of holding members to account and developing policy, but you've also heard all about how that looks and feels substantially different in a committee system, and that the requirement for for scrutiny committees to separately exist in the new system no longer exists. And if you are satisfied that those mechanisms are going to be carried out elsewhere in this structure as proposed, then there is no requirement for a separate scrutiny committee, which would, in the view of officers, and I think in the view of many that you heard from during the inquiry, effectively be a kind of an anomaly, being a hangover from a leader and cabinet system into a committee system. So it is proposed to not have a separate overview and scrutiny committee in the new structure.
Any comments? Are we happy? Do we need to vote on that?
I think given that you voted on the rest,
Right. Say that again.
So we a vote on the recommendation of 1H as it stands. With no amendment.
So, bear with me a moment. So you're saying we haven't actually... Yeah, it's all right. It's the way I'm seeing it, because it's H and then I. It looks like H and little one, so it looks as if you're taking them together. So my apologies, folks. All those in favour of H, please indicate. Thank you very much. So then we come on to I, which is a decision review triggered by 40% of the relevant policy committee's own membership with referral to the Strategy and Resources Policy Committee. Peter?
Chair, do you want me to say anything as an introductory remark?
Yeah, go on.
So, sorry, forgive me, Councillor Garber.
Sorry, Peter, I'll take that away.
So again, I'm very conscious of time. I don't want to unnecessarily draw this out, but this is quite a complicated area, and you've heard and seen in the evidence provided to you during the inquiry a range of different approaches to what happens if a decision has just been made by a committee, and for some legitimate reason there is a need to urgently reconsider that matter. And there are all sorts of different ways of doing this. You even heard that there was one option for a public petition to trigger this kind of thing, although that was particularly unusual. So the proposal here is closest to a system that is called by some councils dissent, whereby if there is a significant minority of a committee that feels that the decision that has recently been made by their own committee needs another look, then they can refer that decision made by their own committee to a different location for reconsideration. You would expect that we will draft for you, if you were to agree this recommendation, more detail around this. That would include, for example, criteria. So this could be done if new information had come to light, as long as it's not vexatious or repetitious or all those other things. That would be kind of standard. So we haven't specified that for you here, and you'll have an opportunity to consider that in due course. The second question is, who then reviews that issue once it has been called in or dissent has been triggered? And under this proposal, there is not a separate standalone dissent committee or review committee, as you heard some other authorities have. The idea is to, rather than having a separate committee to take that decision from a policy committee to the Strategy and Resources Policy Committee, on the basis that they've got that overarching viewpoint and will be in a good position to take a view on any required review of that decision. What's not specified here is a mechanism that would apply to the Strategy and Resources Committee. That is, I suppose, conspicuous by its absence. And members may wish to specify that today. Your assumption perhaps could be that if a similar mechanism was triggered for Strategy and Resources, that the issue would then go up to full council. That would be my assumption, but it is not specified at this point. And if you don't seek to specify it today, we'll bring you a recommendation on that in due course. The other thing I suppose I should add is that there would be a time limit on this. I would expect it to mirror your current call-in arrangements. I think that's either 3 or 5 days, I don't recall. So that there would be a point beyond which this mechanism could not apply.
Councillor Garbutt.
Thank you, Chair. Just reflecting back some of the thoughts of our group on this, there were questions about why it needed to be the committee's own membership or limited to the committee's own membership. Why could not call-in be done by, say, 5 of any councillors? And I think you also mentioned the possibility of it being triggered by the public in some way, and we probably might want to consider that, but not here. So I think it's why should it be 40% and why should it be the policy committee's own membership? And I think those are the questions that I'm reflecting back from our group meetings.
I'll bring Sue in first, thanks. Sue?
That's because she knows what I'm going to say. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, very similarly, we wanted to raise questions around, because at the minute, call-in requires at least one person from a scrutiny committee plus people, any other councillors, to a certain number, and why we could not have something that reflected that. So, you know, maybe 2 members of the committee and 4 other councillors. I'm just plucking numbers out of thin air here, but as an example. If there is good reason why it should only be members of that same committee, then I think our view would be very much that 40% is too high, because that really is quite a threshold, and that maybe a third or 30% might be better. So I'll leave that there now in case there's some good reasons why it is as it is.
Councillor Leverett.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, this area does cause me some concern. If members haven't got the ability, and it doesn't matter whether they're on that committee or they're not even on any policy committee, but they might be in the lax, that there's an issue there that they really want to call in, they have that availability now. And that is being lost through this process, I feel. And I think we need to have a rethink on this one. Thank you.
Alex?
So, this is one of those areas where the playing board has fundamentally changed. The concept of call-in, as it applies under a leader and cabinet model, is basically just a fundamentally different arrangement of who can take decisions and what the role of the various political parties and therefore backbenchers from the opposition and from the leadership group, how they relate to decision makers. It's quite, in a way, it's quite a subtle point, but this is really fundamental to the way that a committee system is different to the current system. So forgive me, I'm going to try and explain this. It might take a moment. Call-in at the moment provides the only opportunity for members who are not in the administration's select group of cabinet members to have any say on whether an issue is being appropriately decided. It is not at all possible for any opposition groups or any other groups to be involved in that process unless the administration chooses for some reason to give seats on its own cabinet to its opposition, which to my knowledge has never been done anywhere in the country unless you're in a coalition or whatever, and then they're part of the administration. So in the new system, when a committee makes a decision, they have the sovereign authority to, not sovereign, because council can also do it, take it off them, but they have the authority to take that decision, and it is a politically proportionate space. So all of the party groups will have had an opportunity to consider their party political position and feed into that decision in that point, and dissent should be captured inside that committee. And when you look at it that way, because it's a politically proportionate space, there's logically no reason why a member who is not on that committee but who is otherwise in one of those groups should have grounds to dissent in a way that hasn't already been captured inside that political discussion at the committee, unless some new information has arisen or some kind of particular flaw in the decision-making process. And what we're saying is that if that were the case, if that there was some new information or particular flaw or whatever, it's appropriate for that dissent, that space for dissent inside that politically proportionate space, to be expressed by those members who had that decision-making authority. So the idea is that we're creating a space for that avoids just taking a decision from one politically proportionate space to another politically proportionate space and expecting a different outcome. You would argue that, it's a definition of madness. Do the same thing again and expect a different result. If you're taking something from one committee to another, you better be really sure that there's a reason why a different outcome would come out if they're both politically proportionate spaces. So on the basis that that you'd have something really specific and unusual would have to have happened, the idea is behind this is that we're trying to avoid the opportunity for mischief or less uninformed members from outside that committee space that haven't got all the information that the committee had done. They might have had a task and finish group exercise, a whole load of evidence presented to them, made a sovereign decision, and then 5 members who had nothing to do with the committee, not been on any of that activity, don't know the detail, can sort of take it off them and put it in another politically proportionate space where you assume the same outcome would happen because it's politically proportionate, in theory. So we're sort of saying that seems like an inefficient process where you can ping something around without it being from inside the committee. However, it is also legitimate for there to be a process whereby people from outside the committee can look in and say, well, regardless, we think that should be looked at again in a different space. I'm not saying it's illegitimate or impossible. You could decide to do that, but I'm trying to provide an explanation for what I think is in this report. As for why it would be 40% or 30 or whatever, it's a balance between you don't want this happening every week, you're going to completely snarl up your decision-making process. What is modern about the modern committee system? Well, it's that it moves quickly, that committees are able to take a decision and the decision is made. It doesn't have to go somewhere else to be ratified. You don't have every minute going to council for, this is about decisions being made in a place and moving on with the made decision. So the idea behind 40% is that it's high enough that it's not going to get triggered every week at every committee, but below 50%, so that although the committee could make a majority decision, there could still be a trigger of that process from the rest of the members after a majority decision was made. That's the logic behind the 40%, I think.
Thanks, Alexander. Yeah, I do understand this, but the current system doesn't get abused. I reckon we've got half a dozen call-ins a year, if that, something like that. It's not a big issue, but it does give some reassurance to members who are particularly aggrieved about a decision to come back on it, and I think we still need to maintain that.
Chair, sorry, there's one other thing I should have mentioned. Do you mind if I do? It's only that, remember what is different about, another thing that's different is that the current system, if you call something into scrutiny, it has no power to overturn that decision. All you're getting is an audience, soft power, a public space to say we disagree. In the new system, if you trigger this process, the place where it goes for review can actually overturn that decision. So that might lead to a different calculation about how often or how important it is to attempt to use it. I guess it's important to bear that in mind as well.
It's a strange world out there, isn't it? Any further questions or comments? Any proposals? So,
Chair, well, firstly, I think this is, whatever way we go with this, I think it's really important that we, this is going to be something we're going to have to really keep a close eye on when we do our reviews, is what I think I'm going to say. I'm going to make a proposal that we change the 40 to 30 and that we ask that when we get to the sort of second stage of this process, because presumably the detail of this is going to come to the February meeting, that consideration is given to whether councillors who are not actually on the committee should be able to be part of that number. So if the number is determined as relevant to the relative to the size of the committee, just to give us a chance to have another look at whether among those, so if it's a committee of 12, I know it won't be, but let's make my sums easy, and we say 30%, that's 4. So, you know, whether 2 of those must be from the committee and 2 could be other people. I just think we need to think this through a bit more before we make a definite decision today.
before I come into Sean Edward, have we got a seconder for that? Right, thank you. Sean Ed.
Shall I say those words again? But I agree with Sue. But I think when you say that we need more discussion about it, I think that's the bit that I agree with, because I think, like you, I thought this all seems a bit blur, and then having heard Alex's explanation, I'm sort of thinking, oh, right, yes, I understand that, why you're doing that, but I still get the blur bit. Can we just not do any voting on this bit and go away and have another think and talk about it? You know, sometimes we talk informally so that we really understand what we're doing. I'm not sorry, that sounds rude, doesn't it? Like nobody understands what they're doing. I just think that that's the bit we do need to have another discussion about it, because we're all a bit not quite sure. I don't know if that's helpful or not, Sue.
So,
I think if the officer's advice is that we don't need to take a decision on this and that we can think about this in more detail today, then I would be happy to accept that.
Members know I was keen to try and push you to give me clear steers and recommendations rather than ask us to go away and think, but purely for reasons of pace. I think in this case, in the absence of a specific alternative proposal coming from the committee, that an amendment along the lines of that further consideration be given to the process for review of decisions for the committee's future consideration. I think that would be acceptable if members wanted to move that and vote on it.
Are members happy with that? Can you indicate, please? Thank you very much. Does that cover that, Alex? Okay. Do we need another vote?
Yeah, I think you just voted to amend the section I.
So we need substantive.
So now you need to vote on the substantive motion as amended.
Those in favour of the substantive? That's unanimous. Thank you. Okay. So the last of our CD, etc., is J, and a requirement for the council with statutory responsibilities for children to be chair of the policy committee with responsibility for children. Any questions or comments on this? All those in favour? Any against? It's passed. Right, now I'm confused, .com. Where do I go?
We'll go to recommendation 2, 3 and 4 and 5.
Right.
In bulk, we'll have a discussion on each first. I don't mind.
So now we're going to number 2. Now we've done number 1, and it is simply the methodology of agreeing the size of committees to be developed for the committee's consideration based on the need to deliver a politically proportionate allocation to each committee and membership overall. So, sorry? Yes, absolutely.
So members, on paper this is a simple one. This is about setting a parameter for the size of those committees. And, you know, the figure 8 to 11 is based on the discussion that you had, and Councillor Alston was doggedly following this route of inquiry during the inquiry, to sort of see what other people do. But as you heard in one of the questions before the meeting, or at the beginning of the meeting, from a member of the public, and as per the discussion in the report, there is an implication which is important to consider because of the way that some of this has been discussed during the process of campaigning around the referendum. So this is about how many total seats would that end up with there being across the policy committees, and is there a need for that number to equal 84 or more? You'll have seen that the report argues that there is not a necessity for that, and that there are, first of all, when members are sat on strategic committees, they are there in a strategic Sheffield City Councillor role, not as a local councillor with exclusively local concerns. Second of all, there are a number of strategic committees, such as planning and licensing, that would add to the number of seats that members can sit on. Overall, members will certainly not have a shortage of committees to sit on with a strategic degree of responsibility. And lastly, I would say, although I understand the logic behind the argument, any one of these policy committees, or indeed licensing, or indeed planning, will still only have a minority of all of the councillors on it. So, you know, the majority of councillors will not be involved in any one decision made by any of these committees. So the argument that says that overall there's a need for every councillor to be on one of these committees, to me doesn't make logical sense. Although I understand how it appeals to the kind of the gut sentiment about, hold on, everyone needs to have a role. Members can be assured that in this new system there will be no shortage of strategic, citywide decision-making committee roles for all members to play. In fact, I think you will find some members with perhaps as many as half a dozen committees to sit on, especially if you include being nominated substitutes for committees. It's going to be a busy place to be. In my view, that's not a need to make this a bigger number. However, you could, if you wish, hedge your bets. At the beginning of the year, the proposal is that we'll work up something that says, when we calculate proportionality for your agreement at council at your AGM, there'll be some flexibility over committee numbers. So we'll adjust the size of the committees based on what works best with proportionality. You could say that could be between 8 and 12 members on each committee, and if you get to 12, well, lo and behold, you're somewhere near 84. So what you could do is you could increase the scope of this bracket, meaning that the issue essentially comes up at each AGM as to how many seats you want on all these committees, rather than excluding that possibility at this stage by putting a bracket on those committees that is smaller than 84. But as I wish to say, as a primary point, I don't think it really ought to be a consideration, except that there has been a kind of a public discussion on this matter, and I think community groups and campaigners have made their view on it clear for their own reasons.
Councillor Leverett.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think what would greatly aid us is a full picture of all committee membership numbers and substitutes, so we can get the frame there and understand what the commitments will be according to the different numbers of policy committee members. Thank you.
Chair, through you, I can say, first of all, we have done that work, and apologies to my colleague Hannah, who produced it as an appendix for this report that I deleted on the basis that it was this thick and not that helpful to you in this setting. So we absolutely have it. In summary, as I think it says in the report, there's something in the order of 300 and something seats across all of the committees. So we absolutely know that figure, and it's not a small number.
Any further questions or comments? Are you happy to vote on this? Those in favour? Thank you very much. So, item 3, that the monitoring officer be asked to redraft the constitution in line with the report for members' agreement between now and the 2022 AGM, including by making compatible recommendations to this committee of all the other aspects of the system not defined yet by this paper.
Thank you, Chair. I think the last bit of that is really important because we haven't covered everything, and it would be an incomplete constitution if it was done from what we've voted on today. So I think it's really important that, although we can take this decision today, that the redrafting should be done with all the other decisions yet to be taken kept in mind.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Happy to vote? All those in favour? Unanimous. Thank you very much. So then we move on to 4. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Give me, Chair. Recommendation 4 and 5 are just a note, so you can take them together if you wish.
Thank you very much. So we can do one less voting. So to note that the extraordinary council meeting on the 23rd of March for the purpose of and that the requirement of council to suspend or adjust aspects of its standing orders for its 23rd of March meeting in order to effectively handle this business be noted. So.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a question really about the process when it comes to the full council meeting, which we're all looking forward to on the 23rd of March. My understanding from what I've read is that although each group will be able to put forward an amendment should it choose to do so, that rather like the budget, it must be an all or nothing. And I just wondered why that was the case, whether there may not be, I sort of understand it for the budget, because it's all related to each other, but why there may not be some aspects of this that you could actually have a different view on without altering all of it, if you see what I mean.
So, I do agree it's not exactly the same as the budget. The reason this has been proposed is because so many of these aspects do interrelate. If you're deciding not to have I don't know, urgency subcommittees, then it might have an impact for how you draft urgency procedures for all the other committees, that might have an impact on how often they need to meet, and these things kind of cascade through. And it's just really important that we don't end up with a system that where we can't draft a constitution that without fault lines in it on the back of whatever comes out of full council. And because we'll need to operate using that constitution immediately at the point that it's agreed in the May AGM, it's a very big risk if we allow there to be a possibility that we've got a constitution that doesn't function at that point. So that's why the proposal is there, to do it in this way.
Happy with that? Any other questions or comments? So if we vote on 4 and 5 together, please, those in favour? Thank you very much. I believe that is now the end of the meeting. No? Oh, what am I not looking at? I'm not looking at Laurie. It's just that I've moved across with papers in a very strange way, so I'm not sure where I am. Thank you. Yeah. So, after chaos reigneth once again. So we have the... the governance report that is going to be presented by Laurie? Yes? No?
Thank you, Chair. As part of this report, I'll briefly overview it, but as part of this, we're going to be joined on screen, hopefully, by Sarah Allen from Involve, who you all met at a committee meeting in October, I think. But we'll, by the wonders of technology, we'll try and dial her in right now. But I'll begin talking while we're doing that. Anyway. Okay, so this is an update for the committee on the piece of work that the second piece of work that's part of the committee's remit, really, around the engagement stream of this. In some ways it acts as an update, and then there are obviously some recommendations on the paper as well about where we go next, which is really why Sarah's dialing in to give you a kind of an overview of the work she did before Christmas. As you know, just covering the first section really, from paragraph 1 onwards, you'll know from the work that members have actually been involved in directly, where we did things, for example, doing pop-up engagement sessions at Crystal Peaks, for example. We've done a whole plethora of almost like weekly or fortnightly physical events or virtual events, just open access to members of the public, to the community, talking to us about the development of the proposals you've just worked through. As you can see, Sarah's on screen now, so I'll introduce her in a minute. And through that piece of work, through looking at the design principles and looking at the various aspects of the framework which made up the paper you've just been through, and we've had some absolutely fantastic engagement from a whole range of stakeholders, from academics, from members, from people, citizens in Sheffield, just really keen to get involved. And I wanted to say a huge thank you to Laura and to colleagues in BCIS who've been absolutely fantastic in that, but also to you as members as well for the time you've put into that as well, and Julie as chair, but also Penny as well, just talking to citizens and hearing their voices around the various aspects of this. And we couldn't have got to that point, the point we're at now, if we hadn't have done that piece of work. It shapes those design principles, and it's also shaped some of the thinking that's driven that framework. What we learned through that, a lot of that exercise really is, if you look on the bottom of page 4 of your paper, so point 6 onwards really, was a sort of a bit of a summary there of some of the core messages that came out of some of the conversations we've had from citizens. Some very focused on the aspects of the committee system proposals themselves. Some more broader comments about the sort of the way we do business, if it is the best phrase I can think of, the sort of the way we operate as a city council, not just as members but as officers, and some key points around what the citizens think they need to be part of the change we're about to go through. So just running down that list about things about how we listen and respond, how we build that stronger accountability and trust, and building confidence of citizens. And I think what you've seen today and the things you've just voted on are part of that process. How we ensure that diverse communities in the city are best represented through the committee system. How we connect to those communities, and again we had a good conversation earlier about the local area committees, and I think that's part and parcel of that, but it's also about how we connect to community organisations as well. How people feel connected and informed about what's happening, and I think there's lots of work underway on that, but as we've seen through the committee system, we've conversations, we've tried to keep people in that loop and maintain that growing list of stakeholders through things like our communication emails from the council about what's happening and how the work's progressing. Quite an important point which I'll come back to in a minute about how all this hangs together as well. So it's not just about citizen empowerment, citizen engagement in the committee system, it's about in everything we do. So we'll come back to this point, and there were points raised in the conversation we've just had about the formality around how citizens have a voice through a committee, i.e. public petitions, public questions, that sort of thing. And that, as Councillor Dale said at the time, is really important, where the members of the public feel in coming to this room and to other rooms to present and talk to members. And that makes complete sense and is absolutely right and a foundation of democracy in Sheffield. But there is also something about how content that is ultimately brought to those policy committees, how's that formed? It's the work of officers and members and how that's done, how citizens are involved in those conversations, everything from consultation right through to strategy development and everything. And some of that is a challenge we've got as a council, and how much capacity and expertise we've got in that, which is where Involve's work was going to come into this. So that's just a summary of the things people talk to us about. So the summary of that is effectively they talk to us about a lot more than just the committee system. It was about the ways of working, the behaviours and the skills and attributes we need as a council to be empowering and to be engaging. So before Christmas, I'm going to invite Sarah to just give a summary of this. You as members received a paper which summarised some of the work involved wanting to do. And if you look at, I think, the paragraph on paragraph 12 is probably not doing it an appropriate service, really. I think it suggests we were jumping into public participation, which is a critical part of this. I think what Involved talked to us about and presented to the committee was a sort of a package around looking at how internally we as a city council are best equipped to do this. How is our approach is going to be best supporting to enable people to have a voice and to influence decisions, but also and looking at members and officers and the capacity we need, thinking about how citizens want to be involved as that, and how do we ensure that citizens, we've used the term seldom heard before, but how people from all parts of Sheffield and every community get a voice in that. And also then some training and mentoring in this space involve some leaders in this field about capacity building and giving that training and expertise to organisations, and I think we want to tap into that. So as part of this piece of work, Involve started by looking at a conversation with citizens in Sheffield, a mix of stakeholders who've participated in the development of the committee system to date, but then also representatives from a whole plethora of community organisations, from forums in the city, to say, okay, so if we're going to go out and do this work, we're going to try and answer that question that you can see there under paragraph 9 about how we make decisions in a way that empowers people in Sheffield and is inclusive, accessible and representative and connected to all communities. What should we do to go about doing that? And Involve talk to them about methodologies and approaches to do that. I've summarised it in some bullet points there, but I think it's probably better because I didn't participate, because I don't think it was appropriate for me to be involved. It was about the citizens and Involve hearing that. So Sarah, if you can hear us, can I just hand over to you to just summarise the findings from those stakeholder conversations through those roundtables at the beginning of December? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just first of all, thank you, Sarah, for coming on behalf of members. Sorry for the bit of chaos. I'm not Julie, obviously. Julie's had to go because she's been called away. So I'm Councillor Penny Baker. You're going to have to put up with me today. I'm sorry.
It's fine. Nice to meet you. On the stakeholder tables there. Oh, I can hear myself back. So I'm going to... Does the audio work for you? Is it just me? Okay. So I just might have to, as I speak, because I can talk back to myself. Right. So we had the roundtables in December with the stakeholders, and I think the first thing to say is that they were really useful and really constructive conversations where people gave real insight and were very generous with their expertise about and their experience of engaging people in Sheffield. So just wanted to thank the people who attended those roundtables very much. Given that they gave such detailed feedback, I can't go through everything they said. So what I've done is pull out some of the key themes from the conversation. And I think it's important to say that whilst we did hold 2 roundtables, one, as Laurie said, for academic citizens and stakeholders who'd given their time to participate in the community system and engagement state, and one for individuals representing community organisations across the city, the feedback from both of them was very consistent. The main themes were essentially the same. So I think the overarching point was that both groups were quite surprised that the council was interested in running a more or less one-off piece of public engagement around how to engage the public in the new with the new structures and in the new structures, as opposed to asking us to work with you to develop some thinking about the longer-term vision for how public participation and engagement in the new structures could work, and that kind of surprise framed the comments that we got, I think, throughout the roundtable. And that surprise was founded on a few different reasons, some of which are actually quite positive. So firstly, the people felt that you'd already done a lot of public engagement as a council about what was and wasn't working for people in terms of how you engage them, and that they felt that you had enough from the engagement that you'd already done to take this work a step further without doing more public engagement on the subject, and that actually it was quite important that you were seen to use the results of the engagement that you'd already done in this area before doing more, in order to kind of show that you'd heard it and build trust around it. A related point to that was, and I guess the one exception to it, was they felt that if in reviewing the results of the public engagement that had happened to date, that identified there were maybe specific groups of people that you hadn't heard from so far, that it would then make sense potentially to do a piece of public engagement specifically targeted at those people, but they didn't think that going out kind of more broadly than that at the moment would be good value for money for you, essentially. And secondly, and related to that, they felt that to kind of meaningfully engage the public around how they would want to be engaged in your new structures, SEC would need to be able to kind of be really clear about the parameters of what is and isn't possible for you, and what is and isn't open to change. Otherwise, there was some concern in the room that you'd get all these ideas back that you wouldn't be able to do anything with. Essentially, rather than getting really useful feedback that you could take forward, take into account. And again, that making sure that feedback was useful to you was really important to building trust. So again, that sort of implied doing the need for a little bit more thinking before going out to the public, which they felt was okay given the previous engagement that you'd already done. In terms of what that sort of next step, that extra bit of thinking the stakeholders were looking for looked like, what essentially they were talking about is starting to flesh out a longer term vision for what public engagement with and public participation in the new structures of the committee system, DELAX, would be like. And they made a number of points during the roundtables about what they'd like to see that long term vision include. Again, I won't go through all of them, but for example, they were keen to see whatever that vision looked like, build on existing infrastructure and good practice in the city. So that, for example, they mentioned the health champions work several times as an example of existing good practice. They'd like to see public participation done in a way that helps to resource work around voice, influence and community building, and for the council to see resourcing the community in that way as positive and as a positive end in itself. And thirdly, they'd like to see public engagement participation really mainstream activity and kind of part of business as usual for the council. And again, they felt that you already had the feedback from the public to do some of that initial thinking before going out to the public again. Once you've done that initial thinking, they actually had a couple of different ideas for potential ways forward on the active sort of public engagement itself. So they thought that once you'd done a bit more thinking, you could go out to the public about that, but they were keen to see that not just to be about extracting information from the public. So they suggested that you could have a dual aim, so explaining that initial thinking about how the public participation and engagement with the new structures would work, with the aim of empowering people to engage in kind of that initial set of ways you're thinking of doing it, and as well as getting feedback from them about what they think about that, so that you could take that forward into kind of reviewing how those structures are going at a later date. Secondly, or alternatively, some of the people at the roundtables felt that kind of asking the public about how they want to be engaged was quite a kind of meta question, and it would make more, they felt would work better to take an action learning style approach. So once there were some initial thoughts about kind of how this public participation engagement would work, to pick an issue or issues that were of more immediate concern for people, so something around health or something around housing, something like that, and to use those to test out the new mechanisms and ways of working and kind of learn what was and wasn't working through doing that. So there were two alternatives. We didn't sort of bottom out which most people liked, but I think it gives you some options, and from our point of view at Involve, and both of those could work as ways forward on the public engagement specifically. As alluded to in the paper that I think you're looking at, attendees at the roundtables did raise a number of wider issues as well that is out of scope for our work with you, but which will influence Sheffielders' willingness and appetite to engage with the council, or is very likely to. So there were issues around trust in the council, the wider culture of the council, and some of the experiences that people have when they engage with the council for something they need, for example, through the website. I'm sure these are points you've heard before, and I won't dwell on them, but it wouldn't have been a true report back from the roundtables if I didn't mention it, because they were points that came up frequently. Laurie, do you feel I've missed anything?
No, I think that was a perfect summary, really, and I think Sarah's going to write up some of that into more detail, which is something we'll share around the committee members anyway. But I think you'll remember coming into this piece of work where we talked about wanting to work in the open and wanting to...
I now can't hear it.
Oh, okay, sorry. Just 1 second, Sarah. It's okay. So we obviously remember that from starting this piece of work, we talked about working in the open, and in the one-year plan, we've talked quite a lot about wanting to be more in and of our communities as well. So it'd be in some ways, it's a brilliant bit of feedback, because it's stopped us maybe going hell for leather on something which actually citizens are saying to us and representatives of citizens are saying, this isn't the sort of conversation we actually need right now. So apart from sitting there and being a bit flummoxed by it to start with, but also recognising that that makes a lot of sense to me, what we've proposed in the paper is obviously involves expertise, and this is absolutely critical to us. But we have an opportunity here to do exactly what citizens are telling us, to listen, to do some work with Sarah to try and capture together the things that we've learned through this piece of activity through the Governance Committee, but also through other things like the Big City Conversation you remember from just before the pandemic. And for example, the local area committees have just done a substantial survey in the last couple of months, which got something in the region of 6,000 or 7,000 responses. We've got lots of good content here which we can start to bring together with Involve to give us a perspective about how people want to work. There is then a second piece of work which is detailed in here a little bit about thinking more longer term about how Sheffield City Council goes about its empowerment and engagement with citizens, and we start to bring that together in a way that is more comprehensive for people. And that then comes with that third element which we've already talked about around that training and capacity building. It feels like it's a really good opportunity that it's not directly delineated from the fact we've got a committee system or we're trying to create a committee system. It's more about that thing that example I tried to give earlier on, where if policy making is happening, if something's coming to the housing committee, how is that work gone about? What sort of parameters are we setting in terms of how citizens get involved in that sort of content development, that strategy development? Do we have the skills and expertise we need as an organisation to make sure that is founded in the voice of the citizens when that comes forward? And I think through having things like local area committees, that really helps us, but it needs to be broader than that, because we talked about community empowerment as part of that. So I think the proposal here is to continue the work with Involve, to bring forward something which captures everything we've learned through this, to inform the development of the committee system in terms of the sort of direct involvement. And the second bit is to then start pulling together that broader piece of work, working with community organisations and citizens about something more significant around where we need to go as a council and community empowerment.
So Alex wants to come in there. Alex?
So all I want to say is I'd like to put this into layman's terms. My area of expertise is not in community engagement. And the way I understand this to have panned out is, we said, shall we go and talk to lots of other people indirectly in communities about this issue? And if so, is this a good way to do it? We started by asking representatives of community groups and stakeholders, and they said, no. We think you already know the answers, pretty much. We've already told you. Listen to what we've said, act on that, and then work with us to check what you implement and to check if there's anyone else who wants a voice about what you implement. That's my, as I understand it, that's my layman's terms summary of what's happened. I think that is a fantastic outcome, to be able to say we had a plan and an approach, but we're going to adjust because we've listened. And it's also helpful because it gives you an opportunity as members to say, right, from what we've heard, here's a plan, let's suck it and see from May, and listen really carefully to people when they tell us whether or not this works for them, and keep adjusting. And to me, that fits well with your timescales and also with the approach you're planning to take with keeping your whole system under review as time goes by anyway.
Thank you, Alex. Do members have any questions or comments they wish to make? Laurie, do you need a vote from us or anything? Oh, sorry, love.
Sorry, I know
Can't miss Shana.
my bright red cardie. It's freezing in here, isn't it? I have a number of vests on as well. I suppose I feel basically, if Peter Price was here now, his famous phrase, "get on with it," which is all one word, would be something he'd be saying. And that's clearly, I think, what the public is now saying to us. But that doesn't mean that we stop listening, like, oh, you've said that, right, we'll get on with that and we'll carry on. It's going to be listening all the way, I hope. But something that's been apparent to me over the last few weeks is that most people don't know how the council works, and I just think it would be really useful if we did a how the council works, 2 sides of A4, without lots of diagrams, but useful words to explain how it goes. I wrote a guide, this sounds pretty stupid, for 8-year-olds about what the council does, and it was just a day in the life of, and it was just everything from when you cross the road safely, the council has provided that crossing, to going to school, to making sure your sweets are safe at the sweet shop afterwards. All those things that we do, that people don't know we do, and also be useful because there are so many things that people think we do that we don't. So if people are cross about the health service, that's our fault, or if they're cross about the gas or electricity. And I just think that would be really useful to lay out for people so that, you know, and I'm sure we're not always sure what we do and don't do, you know. Do we still do stray dogs? Just so that people know, have a feeling of being informed before they talk to us, because I think sometimes talking to councillors and asking them things or saying what you want and not being quite sure if you're asking the right questions would be helped by having some sort of thing like that. I don't know, I think before we become councillors, none of us know, and suddenly we're thrown into it. It'd be very useful for us as well.
Sarah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just that not necessarily the specific idea about two sides of A4, but that the community representatives from the community organisation said something quite similar, and this is where they were coming from when they said that they didn't think the public engagement should just be about extracting information from people about how they wanted to engage. They thought it was a really good opportunity to go out and so both explain what the council does and doesn't do, exactly as just has been said. But also to do that, then do the next bit of that, which is from the point of view of the person in the public. So if you have an issue, where do you go? You know, from someone who then wants to navigate, or if you want to raise an issue, what do you do? Which I think is where they were looking for then just that little bit more thinking about what the answers to that are around the new committee system and around the LACs and around kind of other parts of the council, so that it could be as clear to people as possible. So I just wanted to support what had been said, really, and just emphasise that it came out of the stakeholder roundtables too.
Thank you, Sarah. You don't need a vote or anything from us, do Laurie, do you? Thank you ever so much, Sarah. That really makes a lot of sense, and it's really useful to have you with us. Thank you very much. The only other item I have on the agenda, I think I'm right, is the date and time of the next meeting. No?
Sorry, can I just come back in on that element about the giving something back to the community is fine. I'm sure we've had this conversation right at the very beginning of these governance meetings about there is already something out there that's not utilised about how your city works, and it's delivered by the WEA, and they could rewrite that with regards to a committee system, and it's really good for community participation to find out how it all works, and it's really accessible as well. So I'm sure it's not used anymore because one reason or another, but it is already available, so worth maybe having a conversation with the WEA about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming in with that at the end there. Very useful, very long meeting. The next meeting we have is on the 22nd of February.
Thanks, Alice. Sorry, Chair. You don't have to vote on them all separately, Chair, but if you could just ask the committee to confirm that they are happy with the recommendations in Laurie's report for the record. Thank you.
For the record, are the committee happy with the report? Would you please indicate? Yay! Have I missed anything else? So, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. It's been a long meeting, but a very good one. Thank you very much. The next meeting is the 22nd of February at 10 a.m.